make sense. And this new information does make sense of it.
Well, this new information, in my eyes, it's so substantial, and there's so much of it, and it's so much of it fits together. It's incredibly difficult to ignore, and much more so than when that documentary on the Sphinx was created. That was quite a while ago. Charlton Heston was the narrator of it.
And you know, at that time, we were sticking our necks out, putting that information forward. I was in that documentary as well.
Yes.
But today, things have changed, and what I see is the archaeological mainstream in a state of denial about this information. They just don't want to recognize it and absorb it, but they're going to have to recognize it. It's going to be forced upon them, whether they like it or not.
It's so sad because you count on these people to distribute the information, but their egos get involved in things. And if you've been teaching something for a long time, then it turns out you gave out master's degrees on things that were completely incorrect.
Absolutely.
It's got to be
and something else. Although this sounds a bit conspiratorial, I think the existing view of history is part of a mind control system in our society. It's something that we're presented with, that we take in with our mother's milk, and we're never supposed to question. I think if you control the past, you do actually control the present and the future as well.
So, but you mean if you have an absolutely established narrative that you're teaching and you're unwilling to look at any possible variations to that, you're saying, like, almost from an authority position, we know what happened and we know where we're going.
Yeah.
But if you say, shit, we don't know what happened, then it's, well, then who are you to tell us where we're going?
Exactly. And it starts to raise questions over everything, actually.
Right.
Yeah, and we're kind of in this mode now where there's a very large growing political agenda around the idea that humans are the sole cause of global change and that we're the dominant force within this whole process. Now here we come along and we're saying, well, no, there's actually been forces unleashed on this planet that really utterly dwarf anything we've done yet. What does that do to that paradigm? You see, that's what I think what we're coming down here to. Part of the scenario now is that humans are engaged in causing the sixth great mass extinction, as we talked about in one of the previous. And now we're coming along and saying, well, wait a second, here's something from outer space that has come in and caused the last great mass extinction on Earth. And what's interesting, I found, is that quite a number of the scientists that have been in the opposition to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have been in the forefront of pushing this scenario of human-caused mass extinction and blaming the extinction of the great megafauna that died out 12,000 years ago on human hunters, which again, we talked about that, and I consider that ludicrous that, Paleo-Indian hunters using spears are going to cause the extermination of 10 million woolly mammoths before they could even reproduce, along with 120 other species of megafauna.
Well, 65% of all mammals in North America were wiped out somewhere around that time, right?
Mega mammals, which is over 100 pounds in body weight, essentially. Actually, more like 75%. 75%.
It was almost instantaneous, right? I mean, it was over a course of a very short period of time.
Very short period of time. The scientists who have been diligently working away in this field since they've published their first paper in 2007 have just brought out a new paper, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, July 2015, where they're doing a statistical analysis of all the sites where the evidence comes from. And what that tells us is that this is what is referred to as an isochron. This event 12,800 years ago. We're not looking at the effects of 100 or 200 years of events. We're looking at something that happened effectively in a single afternoon across 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface.
Ooh, that gives me goosebumps. A single afternoon, all over the world, everything changes forever. And it's fucked for 1,000 years.
Absolutely. And then I'd like Randall to address this issue of continent-wide wildfires, because we do see this in the stratum, that when you get this superheated ejecta coming down on ancient primal forests, consider the effect.
This is Murray Springs, one of the Clovis sites, and this is what is known as the black mat layer.
Where's Murray Springs?
It's in Arizona, and it's southern Arizona, and it's near the Clovis site, which is New Mexico.
That's the Clovis impact site?
Well, no, the Clovis site was where one of the first places in North America where human remains were found in association with extinct megamammals, such as woolly mammoths. And it's just outside of Clovis, New Mexico.
They refer to them as the Clovis culture, and because that culture was one of the casualties of this comet impact. The comet impact is often referred to as the Clovis comet.
Okay. Yes, and many of these Clovis sites, and there's been over 50 of them around now documented over North America. I think about 2/3 of them have this black matte layer, which shows up very clearly in this image. Now, that black matte layer is black because of the considerable amount of carbon soot that's in it. So in other words, right there, that's the evidence of your wildfires, is that this blanket of soot over the continent that left this black matte layer. And below that black matte layer, you'll find extinct megamammals. Like here, you see the yellow arrow there points to the black matte layer. Now, if you look up, you'll see how it's more buff colored.
Mm-hmm.
That was the color of all of this, but the soot that was in that black matte layer has dispersed and colored the other adjacent layers. But you'll notice the bones below are the bones of extinct mammals. The bones found above it are extant or still existing mammals. And that layer separates these two domains of extinct mammals and extant
Like
mammals.
just a very clear line.
Yeah, and you can see it shows up so clearly. Right.
To people who are listening to this, when we're looking at the original image that Randall showed, it's almost like an Oreo cookie. Like there's just a clean line, and then there's the white filling underneath. I mean, it is as clear as day. And what are we talking about? Like how much fire and for how long creates this area?
Well, you're basically talking about burning up a considerable portion of the biomass of North America, in unglaciated North America, to do this. And
So you have the ice cap north of roughly Minnesota, and south of it you have a heavily vegetated
yes,
area covered with primal forests. And that's what goes on fire. And the reason it goes on fire is because when these impactors come in, they generate a huge amount of heat, and what is called ejecta, superheated ejecta, is thrown up into the upper atmosphere, and it falls down all over the continent, and it sets the world on fire.
Oh, God.
now at the base,
Perspective is so
Yeah.
difficult in this.
It's a
This
difficult
is it
perspective.
because there's numbers that you guys are throwing around and there's concepts that you're throwing around that I have to pause when you're saying, "Well, wait a minute, I got to try to fit this in somewhere." But it's the whole world on fire.
This is why I've written this book, because it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling material, and up till now, most of the information has been confined to the really rarefied scientific journals. Very little of it has got out into the public domain. So one of the things I've tried to do is to put this together into a form that's very accessible to the general public, because we all need to know about this. This is our yesterday. This is our background. This is where we come from. The present order of the world has descended from that moment.
And what is the mainstream explanation for what we're looking at here? Like how do they describe this?
well, the mainstream, to me now is Firestone and West.
Yeah, and when Randall says Firestone and West and Kennett, he's talking about some of the lead scientists who have presented the evidence for the Younger Dryas impact, because they have triumphed. Although they were attacked, and sometimes viciously, and frankly speaking, sometimes dishonestly, they were attacked, but they defended themselves so well, and they kept on bringing in new data and new information that actually now we should be regarding their view as the mainstream. Yeah, there are a few critics still hanging in there who would like human beings to have been responsible for the extinction of all the mega mammals, and who just are in denial about the climate change at the time. But they're no longer the mainstream in my view.
Well, one of the problems with that theory is what you showed the last time you were here. The evidence of these woolly mammoths that died instantaneously, and that there are massive fields of them. That something had to happen, and ones with like their legs broken, just bent over from the impact. Like it's pretty clear something went down, and all of these pieces point together, and including looking at this, which is just. This is blowing my mind. This idea of the world on fire. It's just.
Well, there were some places that apparently got spared.
Like Australia or something.
Well, Australia actually suffered a major mass extinction, but early, probably from some previous event, maybe 30,000 years ago. But
Just trying to figure out where to go if it happens again.
East Central
Like
Africa
Australia.
seems to have been one of the places of refuge. Because if we look at the distribution of mega mammals in the world today, where do we find the greatest concentration? In Africa, right? Well, Africa has retained 90% of its mega mammals from the Pleistocene, whereas North America lost 75%. If you go back to North America during the Ice Age, there was as many mega mammals, if not more species, than there is in Africa today. But what we see is that extinction relates directly to habitat loss. And basically, not much survived in either North or South America. North and South America were both severely affected by these events and lost 75% of their mega mammals. Eurasia lost depending on where you go, between 30 and 50%. Africa only lost about 10% of them. And that's why you see so many big animals still in Africa today.
Oh.
And a lot of them, I think, probably dispersed from the area around the Great Rift Zone. It seems like, and a lot of the areas actually where we're finding early hominids is in that same area. That seems like, for whatever reason, it was spared somewhat of the extreme severity that the rest of the planet suffered.
It's an interesting situation because when we look at the arguments of history and archaeology, very little of the story is told in North America, as it's taught in schools and universities today. They look at places like Sumer in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and further down in South America, some of the great cultures of the Andes. But it's like North America is missing from the map. They talk about hunter-gatherers coming in here across the Bering Strait, and there's still a dogged faction of archaeology that wants to maintain that just happened about 13,000 years ago, and that there was no human beings in the Americas before that, although the mass of contradictory evidence is overwhelming that dogma as well. It's obvious that the Americas were populated long before that, and those populations did not only come in across the Bering Strait, they came in other ways as well. And then there just seems to be nothing for a very long time. And North America is kind of left out of the story of civilization. Well, now I think we know why. Because North America was at the heart of this disaster. It was at the absolute epicenter, and the slate was completely wiped clean here. And that's what archaeologists are looking at. They're seeing a wiped clean slate, and they think they're seeing the beginning of something. Actually, they're not. They're seeing the movement on of something after a horrendous disaster.
Wow, it's so hard to wrap my mind around this idea that for literally 1,000 years, the Earth was just riddled with asteroidal impacts and fire and nuclear winter because of the dust and mass extinction it's so hard. The numbers that you're throwing around, the ideas behind it, it's very difficult for folks
Can I put something in there that brings it home in a way? See, this event 12,800 years ago, we know now it was caused by fragments of a very large comet. And the work suggests that comet may have been more than 100 kilometers in diameter originally when it entered the inner solar system. See,
that's like 62 miles, right?
Yeah, a big old comet. And these comets, they come in from deep space.
How big was the one that killed the dinosaurs? Like 5 miles?
Well, that's thought to be 10 kilometers wide. That
6 miles.
That object, 6 miles wide, and
10 times that big.
Yeah, these things come in from deep space. There are reservoirs of comets. There's a place that they call the Oort cloud, which is just so far away that it's almost impossible to imagine it. But it contains trillions of comets, and often they're in stable orbits. They're not coming into the inner solar system. But as the solar system orbits around the center of the galaxy, our galaxy is the Milky Way. And we are in orbit around the center of the galaxy. Our sun, our solar system, everything is in orbit around the center of the galaxy. And that orbit is not only in the plane of the galaxy. Imagine a dolphin diving up and down, coming out of the surface of the sea, descending below, rising up again. That's what the solar system is doing. And those passages through the galactic plane disturb the Oort cloud, and they send comets winging in to the inner solar system. Thank God for Jupiter. Jupiter, with its huge gravity, is the great protector of the Earth. We should all wake up every day and say, thank you, Jupiter.
Thank you, Jupiter.
That this doesn't happen too often, but every now and then a comet gets past Jupiter's guard and comes in and enters the inner solar system. And the calculations show this happened about 20,000 years ago. And that comet went into an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth twice a year. We are still crossing the orbit of that comet twice a year. And there is still a very disturbing amount of debris within it. It's called the Taurid meteor stream. We've actually just finished our latest passage through the Taurid meteor stream. The Earth passes through the Taurid meteor stream twice a year. It takes 12 days to pass through it because the Taurid meteor stream, more numbers, is 30 million kilometers wide, and we orbit at the rate of 2.5 million kilometers a day. So 12 days to pass through it. And in the last 11,000 or so years, we've been lucky. We've been passing through this 30 million mile wide stream. We've been passing through bits where there are just filaments of small debris. But the evidence is that it is actually full of large rocky debris, including one object that may be as much as 30 kilometers in diameter, sitting in that Taurid meteor stream. So it's like, I compare it to like strapping on a blindfold and crossing a 6-lane highway and just hoping that you don't get hit by a truck. You know, that's what it comes down to. And we've been lucky so far. Actually, the most recent definite impact from the Taurid meteor stream was in 1908, and that was in Russia, in Siberia. It's called the Tunguska event. As I said, there's 2 passages through the stream, one in June, end of June, early July, and one in November. And this was at the end of June. An object not very big, about 100 meters in diameter, came out of the Taurid meteor stream, entered the atmosphere of the Earth, and actually blew up in the sky. It was an airburst about 5 kilometers above the ground. It flattened 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. I'm sorry, I keep using kilometers rather than miles. 2,000 square kilometers of the Earth's surface. That's an area about the size of the city of London. If that impact had happened over an inhabited area, hundreds of thousands of people would be killed. And we would all be paying much more attention to the Taurid meteor stream today than we are presently doing. We should be paying attention to it.
So we just got super lucky that it hit in a very lightly populated area, and it didn't even hit. It blew up in the sky above it. Pull up, see if you can find some image of Tunguska, because it's pretty staggering. And it literally looks like there was like a matchstick forest that someone pushed over, like a series of dominoes or something.
Oh,
God.
Jamie pulled that one up.
Jamie's a wizard. Kids on the ball. Look at him over there.
Yeah.
God.
So here's the thing. We are still interacting with the debris of this comet that changed the world 12,800 years ago. It's not something remote and distant. It's part of our daily lives. And it is something we should be paying attention to. And a number of astronomers are very concerned about the Taurid meteor stream. Now, I don't want to be the one who goes around the world, wearing the sandwich board, saying that doom is nigh.
Literally, the sky is falling.
Yeah. I don't want to be that. I don't want to manifest that. I don't want to bring that down. I actually want to say that there's something positive to say about this. We are almost certainly the first civilization that's ever existed on this planet that has the capacity to intervene in our cosmic environment, should we choose to do so. We can make sure that we are not the next lost civilization. We can make sure that life and light continue on this planet and that our story continues. But we need to pay attention to our cosmic environment. And a number of scientists are now saying the same thing, that it's irresponsible of us to pretend that impacts like this, they just happen every 100 million years. We don't need to worry about them. We are intimately connected with a force that can change life on Earth, and we have the power to do something about it. So I would suggest, instead of wasting, trillions of dollars globally, creating weapons of mass destruction to destroy one another and to manifest the hatred and fear and suspicion that are just whizzing around the world right now, we should be looking at a grand human project, a cooperative effort to make our cosmic environment safe. And we have the technology now. It's just a matter of choice. It's just a matter of budget. Trillions of dollars are spent on arms, and roughly $20 to $30 million are spent a year on so-called space watch. It's a ridiculous chump change, given the nature of the threat and the implications.
About the same as the cost to run one McDonald's restaurant for me. That's what we're spending on studying the cosmic environment in terms of threats.
That's a hilarious comparison. What a resourceful little freaky animal people are. If you really stop and think about it, almost wiped off the face of the planet, 10,000,
bouncing
12,000 years ago. And then we reach a point where here we are in 2015, and through all these inventions, we're starting to rediscover what our history truly is, and rediscover the history of the earth and its interplay with all these cosmic forces.
Modern humans have now, what, 190,000?
Yeah, the earliest definite anatomically modern human skeletal remains date back about 196,000 years. There's some other plausible ones at about 210,000 years. Nothing before that. It doesn't mean that we were not anatomically modern before that. It may just mean that archaeologists haven't found the data yet. But we can be sure that people like you and me have been around for about 200,000 years with the anatomically modern form and the anatomically modern brain. So there's a mystery right there. Why did we wait 190,000 years to establish the first civilizations? It raises the possibility that we could have done so much earlier, and that the slate has been wiped clean.
Think about it this way, Joe. My grandfather was born in 1895. The main mode of transportation, aside from railroads at that time, was horseback, right? His grandfather, would have been born pre-Civil War. So in 5 generations, we've gone from the very first railroads, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, to where we are now, in 5 generations. Now, if you go back 200,000 years, say 196,000, and we divide that by 25,
I love when Randall breaks out.
we're looking at almost 8,000 generations of humans. Now think about that. Within 5 generations, we've gone from 90% dominant, agriculturally based, subsistence farming, right, feudal system, to where we are now. But now we've got 8,000 generations of humans on this planet. Who knows what we may have accomplished in the past? But once you put this perspective, and you got to understand that the catastrophe we're talking about 12,000 years ago, while all the evidence suggests it was the most severe, probably at least within 5 million years, because the last time we can find a species loss equivalent to the terminal Pleistocene species loss was 5 million years ago, the Hemphillian event it's called, which then I would then consider that again as a measuring stick for habitat loss, which would in turn be a measure of the severity of whatever happened. But the point is that in the time that we humans have been around, there have been multiple catastrophes of a global scale, not as severe as the one we're talking about here, but certainly the framework of this planet has been shaken numerous times. And in 200,000 years, we've had probably 4 great glacial cycles that have come and gone. Now, just the glacial cycle alone, think about that, what the ice will do to the landscape, and dropping sea levels 400 feet. And now during an ice age, you've got to bear in mind that probably the most habitable place to be on the planet is going to be on coastlines, along the mouths of rivers and so forth. What happens when all that ice melts and sea level comes up 300 or 400 feet? And it's going to pretty much erase most of the evidence of human habitation. Although, and I think I talked about this last time, and you would probably concur with this, the importance of marine archaeology.
It's extremely important.
Yes.
But again, unfortunately, marine archaeology has its eye off the ball. Most of the resources in marine archaeology go into shipwrecks, looking for shipwrecks. And I get that. It's really interesting to look at shipwrecks, but there is a prejudice in archaeology which says there could have been no interesting civilization before 12,000 years ago. So since those lands that were submerged by rising sea levels have been underwater for 10,000 years, we're not really interested in human habitations there. And this is the problem. A very focused effort needs to be made to look at these lost lands. I can put that in miles. 10 million square miles of the Earth's surface, roughly Europe and China added together, was submerged by the rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. That's what's missing from the record, And again, we're talking about wiping the slate clean. And Randall's right. Those ice caps that sit on top of a continent, which are mountain high, they're going to just grind to powder anything that lies below them. So was there a civilization there before where the ice cap formed? Who knows?
Right.
A mile high of ice.
Even more than that in some cases. Over central Canada, it might have been as much as 2 miles.
2 miles.
2 miles of
ice. Just pushing across the ground like an eraser.
Exactly.
Just
Yeah,
wiping
and
everything
crushing the surface of the ground down. I think in our discussions of Atlantis, we covered that a little bit. Crushing the surface of the land down by perhaps a couple of thousand feet. Isostatic depression. You remember the geology lesson I gave you last time
Yes.
about isostatic depression? And
Yes.
we discussed how at this very moment, your ass is demonstrating an important geological phenomena of isostatic depression, sitting on that cushion that you're sitting on. And if you were to stand up, what happens when you stand up? The cushion comes back up, doesn't it? It's exactly what happens, and you can almost picture the planet breathing in effect. The ice is released from the continental surface. The continental surface begins to rebound. The weight is transferred back into the ocean basins, and there has to be what's called rheology, which is the study of the distribution of the inner mass of the Earth, requires that there be compensation. So if in one area of the surface the land is rising, somewhere else it has to be subsiding. And the obvious place would be that as you transfer the weight from the continent back into the ocean basins, that the ocean basins are going to subside. And this brings us, to the whole question of the scientific veracity of a sunken landmass.
I think you have an interesting point on the Azores in this sense, because there you have this massive, it's like a seesaw. There you have this massive weight pressing down on the North American continent, and suddenly it's lifted. That massive weight pushed down North America, but it lifted up other areas, the other end of the seesaw. Then the weight comes off, this end goes up, and the other end goes down.
Yes.
And suddenly you get the possibility of the submergence of a landmass. It just falls under the sea.
And there is actually considerable empirical evidence suggesting that there was massive post-glacial subsidence along the mid-Atlantic ridge.
Which is where the Azores are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And which is pretty much where Plato,
Said Atlantis was.
yeah.
Wasn't there some discovery of some concentric circles that were submerged somewhere near Spain that considered to be a possibility?
Yeah, that's
of
off
Atlantis?
Cadiz. I don't think
Is that
it
near
is.
Spain?
Yeah, it's. I think it's much more recent.
Okay.
Much more recent than the information we're looking at.
So it's just another
it's
port that was submerged.
that was submerged. There could be a lot of reasons why this happens. Actually, it's happening in the UK where I'm from, because the ice sheets in the UK were on the north of the UK over Scotland, and they were pressing Scotland down, and they caused the southern part of England to rise up. Then when you take those ice sheets off, the southern part starts to go down. So that's places like the Isle of Wight in the English Channel. They're sinking beneath the sea because of this. Still, the effect of that rebound is happening.
That's
today.
called the glacial forebulge, where outside the glaciers, the land is pushed up.
This speaks to how people have a hard time accepting some of this new information. I have a friend who's a scientist, and the last time you were on, she said to me, "Did you have a climate denier on your show? A climate change denier?" And I said, "He's definitely not denying it." No. But some people, that's all they hear when you bring forth a non-mainstream point of view or a controversial perspective. Instead of considering the possibility, it almost immediately gets dismissed as
Climate change thing is another ideological struggle. Yeah, sure, climate change is the causes for this. Are we so sure that it's all caused by human beings? I would say there's very good reason for humanity to clean up our act in lots of ways, regardless of the issue of climate change. We're abusing Mother Earth. We're living upon this planet like parasites and destroying it. We thoughtlessly created gigantic ooze of pollution. We're crazy enough, insane enough to actually invent nuclear weapons and, long periods of detonate them, bloody things. There's lots about our behavior that we need to fix because it's right to fix it. Philosophically, right. We should not behave that way. We shouldn't behave that way to one another. We should not behave that way to planet Earth. But to say that we need to fix our behavior because of global warming, that's an ideological argument, and that argument remains to be properly tested. Yes, global warming is a problem. Are we the cause of it, or something else, some grander scale cosmic effect?
We talked about that considerably, and I noticed in a lot of the comments from our last discussion, most of the critical comments were people, not liking the idea that I had questioned the dogma of global warming. But there are some facts that you can't escape. The global warming began 200 years ago. And we see that the glaciers from the Little Ice Age began to shrink back in the early 19th century. before there was, a century before there was any significant human contribution of CO2 to the atmosphere. So something was driving that warming that began. And it's important to realize that the Little Ice Age was probably the coldest period since the end of the Great Ice Age. In fact, the data overwhelmingly supports that, and that the glaciers grew to their largest extent around the planet in 10,000 years. So when we're talking about glacier recession, it's important to understand what the baseline is. Our baseline in this case is the biggest the glaciers have been in 10,000 years. And what's interesting, and this is going on right now, as the glaciers have been receding, geologists and biologists and glaciologists and so forth have been studying the landscapes that are being revealed as the ice shrinks back. And what they're finding is the remains of forests that have been overrun by the Little Ice Age glaciers, and peat bogs and things that would suggest that prior to the onset of the Little Ice Age, those valleys that were filled with ice from roughly 1400 to 1800 were actually forested, because the ice came down and overran these forests, and now it's receding back and revealing that there were forests there. So that tells you that, at some point, probably going back to the medieval warm period, those areas that have been glaciated during the early part of the 20th century were actually free of ice. And so, the climate has been extremely dynamic. That's the thing we have to emphasize, all by itself without any help from humans. And this is what I've been saying, is that we have to look at that and realize that, humans are a factor. Somebody I did post and said, all the other factors I had mentioned as, ocean currents and wind currents and geomagnetic field and cosmic rays and volcanism and all that, had all been investigated and dismissed. And the only thing left was the human contribution. But, to me, that's really, we're putting all our eggs in that basket, and that could turn out to be very dangerous, because we're so focused now on our own contribution that we might be overlooking the fact that there have been natural factors driving climate change over and over and over again. I mean, because I still have not heard any consensus on what has caused the planet to first go into an ice age and come back out of an ice age. And I think that what Brigham and I are talking about actually presents a possible solution to what could have brought this planet out of the ice age, something on a grand cosmic scale. And the other point I think I'd like to make is that we have to really, to understand our planet as a system, we have to realize that it's part of a cosmic ecosystem. And the cosmos has been a much bigger player in what's been going on down here than has been previously understood or appreciated. And I think our ancestors probably did understand.
They did understand it. The focus on the skies, if you go back into ancient times, is so strong. This notion of as above, so below, that we are connected to the cosmos. This is something that we're tending to forget in the modern world, again, because we're so puffed. Anyway, we can't see the sky if we live in cities.
That's, I think, a big issue.
Yeah, light pollution. It's just like up there. We don't see anything. So we're actually cut off from the cosmos psychologically, and that's a mistake, because we are part of this giant cosmic environment, and it affects us. And one of the way it affects us is the way that comets come into the inner solar system from time to time from deep space.
I was camping in Montana recently, and when you're out at night and you look at that night sky and there's no light pollution, it's just a totally different perspective,
isn't it?
And it gives you a different sense of where you are in the universe, because we're so, and it's not necessarily our fault. It's almost like we put up a curtain over the heavens and we can't see through the curtain, because we've decided that we like light and we like traffic lights and building lights and all this jazz, and we don't realize until we're out in the woods or in the wild, until you're in the wilderness and there's no light pollution, you really don't realize what we're missing and what we're sacrificing in order to have these lights. The view of the heavens, it's psychedelic in a way, because it makes you feel like, oh my God, we're really flying through space.
And nice that Mother Nature has provided us with those plants that really help us to appreciate it.
I try to go every year to the Keck Observatory on the Big Island. I try to schedule my holidays as much as possible around the time where there's no moon, because it is unbelievable. Because the Keck Observatory is more than 9,000 feet above sea level. There's the visitor center, and then there's the observatories above, but you really don't even have to go past the visitor center. But the way they have it set up, they have these special street lights all throughout the Big Island with diffused lighting, so it doesn't interfere, it doesn't give you light pollution. When you're up there, you go through the clouds, and the view is insane. It doesn't even look real.
Yeah.
It doesn't even look real. Like, you see all the stars, you're like, this can't be real. How could this be up there every day and we don't see it? But what we've done is create all this incredible stuff, these streets and buildings and laptops and cell phones, and in doing so, we've robbed ourselves of perspective.
Yeah, and it's weird because, you know, we have this technology that enables us to go around the whole world and even go out into outer space, but actually in a way, it's narrowed our focus. We focus in on the technology and its products, and we forget about the majestic cosmic and Earth environment in which we live, how sacred it is, how beautiful it is, how meaningful it is to all of us.
And that was the image that our ancestors always had.
Always.
That's probably why they concentrated on it so much.
And the things that happened up there were evident to them. I mean, because these days, how many people see meteors? Living in an urban environment, you never see that hardly, unless it's really spectacular. But you go out, like you said, in Montana, or one of my favorite places to go out into high desert country, and there it's stars almost, you could reach out and touch them. You know, I think that one of the most important things that we could do for future generations is part of our educational curriculum for young people is get them out of the cities, into nature, into the tremendous, you know, where they can actually see the sky. Because I mean, living in Atlanta, I'll talk to people, even grown-up people that have no clue. You know, they couldn't find the North Star. They couldn't find the plane of the ecliptic if their life depended on it. We've become cut off from that level. And I think it's important for us to keep that, because our consciousness is linked to this greater domain. And we have segregated ourselves from that. And I think that there's something there, you know, amazingly, it's a grounding experience when you get out and you get to see the sky, and you can actually, begin to figure out and identify the constellations, to know where the planets are, to look in the sky. And
It's really good mental exercise.
It
Something
is.
worth anybody doing. Get to grips with all that up there, as the ancients did. It gets your mind working, and it may even have been used deliberately for that purpose in ancient times, as a kind of initiation system. If you can get this, then you move on to the next level. You know, that's the kind of idea.
Well, it was a critical part of education where it's very rarely even discussed today. Astronomy is so.
And look again at the ideology. So, for example, if you talk about astrology to any mainstream scientist, they're going to laugh in your face. They're going to say pseudoscience, because they're so locked into this Earth-centered perspective, which convinces them that the cosmos does have no effect on us. So how can changing patterns of the stars, which zodiacal constellations sitting behind the sun at a particular time, how can that affect us? How can when we were born affect us? I don't think we should throw that baby out with the bathwater too fast. I think we're looking at an ancient science with astrology, and I think it's worth it. It's been heavily diluted and prostituted in the modern world. But if you go back to the antiquity and go into the real origins of this, and you start finding some very interesting information coming out. A fantastic book by called Cosmos and Psyche. And he's a real mainstream, a very major academic, and he's got into this, and he's shown that actually, astrology does have effects. So we should not deny our cosmic environment. That's the first thing we need to do, to connect with it. We shouldn't close ourselves off to avenues of inquiry for ideological reasons. It's noticeable in this field of ancient history how archaeologists throw around words like pseudo-archaeologist or pseudo-scientist. That's meant to be an instant dismissal, just like climate denial. Climate denier. You call somebody a climate denier today, that's like saying, don't listen to anything that guy has to say.
Right.
Never listen to it again. These are ideological tools which are being used to straitjacket the human mind and to stop us thinking outside the box. And if there's ever a time that we needed to think outside the box, I would say that time is right now.
Isn't it ironic that in this time of more information available to the average person than ever before, that this also has coincided with our lack of appreciation for what's above us? It's very strange that
It's a very curious phenomenon.
yeah.
And here's an interesting perspective. You know, as we're talking about how dynamic the planet is and how it's changed and how dramatically different, which it is. I mean, if we go back to the end of the Ice Age, you go east of here, out of the Mojave Desert, that was lush grasslands and forests. You go out here to the Santa Rosa Islands, out here, they were all forested with oak trees and beech trees and Mammothus exilis, which was the pygmy mammoth. I mean, everything down here changes dramatically. But when we go out and we look at the sky, we're basically seeing the same sky that our ancestors of 20,000 years ago were looking at. And that's something to keep in mind, because there's a backdrop to all of this drama and change here below that's pretty much, for the most part, remained consistent. But within that backdrop of consistency, every once in a while, something shifts. And when it shifts out there, I think our ancestors knew that there was a direct consequence here below. And that's one of the reasons they were so obsessed with being able to track motion. All of these ancient observatories, from Stonehenge on down the line to, the mound structures here in North America.
Let's not forget Göbekli Tepe, profoundly astronomical site.
Göbekli Tepe, yes, these were astronomical observatories using the horizon essentially as a telescope, by which very intimate and intricate movements within that backdrop of fixed stars could actually be observed, possibly for predictive capabilities.
And how are the calculations made? Like when an archaeologist finds a site like Göbekli Tepe, how do they correlate the construction of the site with the constellation?
Well, first off, most archaeologists don't do that at all, because they just don't do astronomy. They don't get it. Their eyes are on the ground at their feet.
Right, two different disciplines.
Because astronomy is not relevant to them, they
Right.
project that onto the past and imagine that it was not relevant to the past. And that's one of the big mistakes I think that archaeology makes. There are people called archaeoastronomers who are looking at the astronomy of ancient cultures, and some of them have done very good work. But really, there are certain key indicators. The alignment of the site, what's it pointing at? And does that alignment change down the ages? You can sometimes establish that a particular axis of a particular temple in Egypt, for example, was shifted over a period of 2,000 or 3,000 years several times. And why? Because they were tracking the changing rising point of the star Sirius, which they connected in their system of ideas to the goddess Isis. They were tracking that rising point, which changes because of changes in the sky. I mean, long story short, the Earth wobbles on its axis, and that, since the Earth is our viewing platform from which we observe the stars, changes of orientation of the Earth in space do change the rising times of particular stars at particular times of year. And this was clearly tracked by the ancients. So you can say that if you find anywhere a monument that is perfectly aligned to true north, south, east, and west, you can be absolutely sure that astronomers were involved. If it's tracking the rising sun on the spring equinox or on the winter or summer solstice, astronomers were there. They were right there when they made that monument.
Well, that's one of the scariest, well, not the scariest, but most astounding things when you consider the ancients, that they had an understanding of the precession of the equinoxes.
Exactly.
Which is what, it was a 26,000 year cycle?
26,000 year cycle, 25,920 years.
How did
Very
they...
long, very precise observations, and the motive to make those observations, that this was important to them, and they sought to pass down that importance to us. Very important work by two historians of science called Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschent. Back in the 60s, they wrote a book called Hamlet's Mill, which tracks this ancient knowledge of precession. And they trace it back, and this was very politically incorrect at that time, because Giorgio de Santillana was the professor of the history of science at MIT. They trace it back to what they call some almost unbelievable civilization of prehistoric antiquity that made this up. So they found the data encoded in myths and traditions all around the world. And I do go into this in Magicians of the Gods. They found it encoded as though the data were so important that it had to be passed down to the future. So the numbers that relate to precession of the equinoxes, and they're all based on the number 72 and multiples of that number. Why? Because it takes 72 years for 1 degree of precessional change to unfold. And that's like holding your finger up to the horizon. That 1 degree is just that 1 finger width of change on the horizon. Very precise observations are needed to do it. It's encoded in myths and traditions, and it looks like somebody at some point decided this information is so important, we must make sure that it stays permanently in human culture. So what we're going to do is we're going to encode it in great stories. And those stories can then be passed on by storytellers who will have an ethic that they must tell the story true. It doesn't matter whether they understand the scientific information in the story or not. All that matters is that they pass it on. So in the oldest myths and traditions of mankind, we have compelling evidence for scientific knowledge of the phenomenon that we call the precession of the equinoxes today.
Which has been referred to by in Hamlet's Mill as the Great Year. The Great Year.
Which is the full cycle, 25,920 years, a great circle in the heavens. It's very evident, if you've got thousands of years to watch the sky, it's very evident at the pole. Our pole star presently is Polaris, and that's just simply because the extended north pole of the Earth points most directly at that particular star in the sky. But it hasn't always pointed at Polaris because of the wobble on the axis of the Earth, and it won't always point at Polaris in the future. The pole star changes, but you need to observe the skies for very long periods of time, keep detailed records to get to grips with this phenomenon. This therefore testifies to the fact that some ancient culture was doing this in a very systematic way. It's like a ghostly fingerprint of an advanced scientific knowledge impressed upon the oldest myths and traditions of our planet.
Has it been? Has it been accepted that things like the Mayan temples were built to mirror the constellations? Is that accepted?
It's been accepted. Yeah, it is accepted because we know that the Maya were an astronomical culture, and it is accepted that they were building their temples in connection to the sky, and the whole phenomenon of the Mayan calendar, which we all heard a lot about in 2012. Is another factor to take into account. The Mayan calendar, in my view, is another artifact of a lost civilization. This is that was handed down from a former people, perhaps to the Olmecs and then to the Maya who succeeded them. It's accepted, but the implications of it are not taken properly into account. Remember 21st of December 2012. There was all that fuss and nonsense about the end of the world happening then, and it didn't. But the Maya never said that. They said that the end of a great cycle happened then, which would ultimately transform the world. But what it was actually locked into, and I need to pay tribute to another researcher here. His name is John Major Jenkins. John Major Jenkins has done fantastic work on the Mayan calendar. And a decade before 2012, he was telling people, look, this is not talking about the end of the world on a specific day, on the 21st of December 2012. There's a calculation behind this. And what he showed in that calculation is that it is the position of the winter solstice sun against the background of the constellations. And what has been happening for the last 5,000 years because of precession is that the winter solstice sun, 21st of December, against the background of the constellations, has been gradually shifting towards alignment with the center of the galaxy. And that alignment happened on the 21st of December 2012, but it's not an instant, it's a window. And that window is about 80 years wide, roughly from 1960 to 2040. That was what was focused on the Mayan calendar. A calendar that can predict eclipses of the moon 200,000 years into the future or 200,000 years into the past. Incredible, stunning accuracy, a better estimate of the length of the solar year than we use today in our modern calculations.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
High science encoded in that calendar.
Why don't we just adopt the Mayan calendar? If it's better than what we have, why don't?
Yeah, we're now living in the fifth age of the world, according to the Mayan.
For day-to-day
Wow.
use.
Yeah.
It may not have been
Yes,
correct.
it's probably not good for your iPhone. It wouldn't make a good app. I bet they have them with Mayan
I
calendar.
bet they have a Mayan calendar.
I'm sure they do.
You can think of one half of a degree. Graham said 1 degree every 72 years, right? 1 degree within the great year is like 1 day out of the great year, right? So you can think of 72 years as basically being a human life. So an average human life is roughly like a day of the great year. That's one way, one perspective.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, what he said about the window is because you can't find the center of the galaxy with an exact precise point. There's a diffuse area there, and every 72 years, the spring point is moving 1 degree, which is twice the diameter of a full moon. Full moon is a half a degree, right?
Okay.
And I think that possibly one of the importances of monitoring, because you can't really, you can't go out and look at the sun and say, okay, here's the sun relative to this backdrop of this constellation. However, you can look at a full lunar eclipse, and then you will know that the sun is 180 degrees around. So by monitoring lunar eclipses, you can actually position the sun quite precisely and know where it is in the sky, because obviously you can't go out and look at the sun and see what stars it's related to.
Right.
But during a lunar eclipse, it's 180 degrees. That's precisely on the other side of the Earth from the sun.
So can I just jump in for a second, because I have an image here. I don't know if we can
Go back to the tab.
and it's this image on this side. It's a pillar richly carved, showing
Is that pillar 14?
that's
Is that
pillar
what
43 in
43?
enclosure D. Now I'm not going to go into it in detail now.
I've seen that online, but Jamie will find the images online.
I just want to make the point, and I go into this in this book, Magicians of the Gods, that appears to be a diagram of the sky at the winter solstice in our epoch. The round dot above the vulture's wing, the round circle, represents the sun. And what we're looking at is an ancient constellation diagram. The constellations that we call Sagittarius and Scorpio stand on either side of the galactic center of the dark rift at the heart of the Milky Way, which the Maya saw as the womb of cosmic rebirth. And it's precisely that image that is depicted there. I back it up chapter and verse in the book. I just have to take
Is that why we see the scorpion below?
Yeah. There's an ancient memory that there should be a scorpion in that area of the sky, and it's impressed here on this pillar.
And what are the other constellation clues?
Well, the up on the right, you'll see first of all the vulture with its wings outstretched and
Yes.
the sun over the wing. Then go right of there, you'll see a bird. That small bird is actually the head of our constellation of Scorpio. The tail of our constellation of Scorpio overlaps the scorpion underneath the pillar, but go above the small bird and you'll see a serpent there, a snake, and beside it another bird.
It looks like a penis.
Those represent, we call those constellations today
Yours.
Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, which is represented by the bird there, and we call the serpent constellation Serpens. Other constellations are also involved. This is spooky and eerie because it appears there's overwhelming evidence that the people who made Göbekli Tepe had a profound knowledge of precession, and it appears that they deliberately sent forward into time in this time capsule a picture of the sky in our age, and that is a staggering possibility that I investigate.
I don't understand how it's in our age.
Well, it's only at the winter solstice in our age that the sun sits over the center of the galaxy. The winter solstice, in the area that the ancient Maya called the cosmic womb. There's a dark rift in the Milky Way at that point, and they saw that as the cosmic womb. So it symbolizes a moment of rebirth. And the evidence is that they've been tracking the movement of the sun on the winter solstice, which is also the end of the year and the rebirth of the new year. They've been tracking it to the point where they could project forward and they could envisage the sky in our epoch today. The Maya could do that, and what I'm suggesting is that's done at Göbekli Tepe as well.
It's very hard for me to interpret this. I'm seeing the vulture playing basketball, trying to get away from the scorpion, and there's a penis trying to attack him. Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure.
No, the photograph alone, that's just the heart of the mystery.
Right.
You have to get into the logic of it and compare it with the existing constellations, and I've tried to do that.
Well, it's also fascinating that all of these images were carved in 3D relief. So instead of being, what that means is into, like, you know, people think about like wet cement. You can draw your name in wet cement. Instead of that, what they've done is they've removed everything around it to create these images, which is a much more sophisticated way.
This is what's called high relief. Interestingly, you can see at the top of the pillar there are three things that look like handbags.
Mm-hmm.
That symbol crops up all over the world. It crops up in Mexico, it crops up in Mesopotamia, it crops up in India, everywhere. And again, I think we're looking at symbolism that goes back to a very remote period, which we know is at least as old as 11,000.
Maybe what they're trying to say is that shopping will be the end of us all.
I think those bags held their stash.
Really?
And I'm half serious, because this is another issue that is ignored by the mainstream. Is the use of psychedelics in ancient civilizations was fundamental to the quality of those civilizations. And this is another area we're in ideological denial about, because the powers that be in our society don't like psychedelics. They don't want ancient cultures to have liked them either, and they just ignore the evidence for that.
I think it's one of the main points of view that when you don't consider them, it makes me really reluctant to listen to a lot of the other things you have to say, because it's undeniable the impact those things have on human consciousness.
Undeniable.
And it's also undeniable that many civilizations use them as a part of their spiritual rituals. And the fact that this is not thought of as an important aspect of our history, when all it means to me is the people that are talking about it haven't experienced it.
Exactly, that's the problem.
That's the only, yeah.
The
that's the real
archaeologists who are the entrusted with interpreting our past to us. Unfortunately, most of them have never taken a psychedelic in their life, so they don't know about it.
problem. Look, I just need 15 minutes of your time.
And
One DM teacher,
exactly.
15 minutes, and the whole thing will be so much clearer.
So much clearer. Exactly. I think it's an important experience for archaeologists to have, because it was a universal experience in the ancient world. We demonize psychedelics today, and we pretend that they are just totally negative things. But in the ancient world, they were revered and enshrined. They were at the heart of the ancient mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece used a potion related to LSD, which brought about a revelation for the initiates, changed their lives, just in the way that a powerful psychedelic trip can change our lives today. So just like writing about history and the origins of civilization without taking account of, whoops, this gigantic cataclysm that happened 12,800 years ago, that's a mistake that archaeology is making. The other mistake they're making is they're not considering the role of all states of consciousness in ancient civilizations.
Ideological blinders
Ideological
keep
blinders.
us from looking at possibilities. I don't know whether or not that's stash or that's just chicks' handbags. It's like the same shopping. Malls will ruin us all. That's
But
what
the
I'm
weird
getting
thing is that it's all that this symbolism is all over the world.
What if Göbekli Tepe was a mall? That's
Now you may have something there.
the symbolism of these purses.
Yeah,
This,
yeah, it's found all over the world. For example, we'd have to find an image, but there's the earliest image of the figure known as Quetzalcoatl in Mexico survives from the Olmec area of the Gulf of Mexico, and it was found at a site called La Venta, along with a lot of other buried stone artifacts. And it shows a man sitting within the coils of a serpent, and that serpent has a crest on its head, because that's what Quetzalcoatl means. It means a feathered serpent. And that man is holding one of those bags, just the same as the...
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
The Sumerian fish man.
The Oannes, the Uanadapa, the originator of civilization in Sumer, ancient Sumer, according to their mythology, he's always depicted holding one of these bags as well. So I find myself wondering, are we looking at the symbolism of some ancient brotherhood, who passed around the world seeding civilizations, and that this was the equivalent of their Masonic handshake or something? This was their badge of recognition, this bag that they carried.
Well, it's just speculation, right?
It's pure
fun,
speculation.
It's interesting.
It's pure speculation.
But so because of the fact that they've accepted that the Mayan temples are aligned with the constellations, have they decided to look at other archaeological discoveries in the same light, or is this something
as I
that's being
say,
resisted?
there is a specialized subdivision of archaeology which is called archaeoastronomers.
An accepted
It's
subdivision.
an accepted subdivision. These are archaeologists who've been trained in astronomy, but they've also been trained in the fundamental dogmas of the discipline of archaeology, which is that there can be no lost civilization, that archaeology has already told pretty much the full story of humanity, and that all that awaits is to fill in the details. This is the dogma of archaeology that is taken in from the moment that somebody decides to become an archaeologist, part of the training. And actually, if you try and go against that dogma as a mainstream archaeologist, you can kiss goodbye to your career. Any archaeologist who entertains the possibility of an advanced lost civilization around the world more than 12,000 years ago will have no future as an archaeologist. That right there will write him off for the rest of his career.
That's so disturbing. It's so
deeply
disturbing if that's true, it's so mind-numbing, because why would you ever believe that we've got it all figured out, where every day they find some new stuff? Did you see the discovery they found recently of a large tooth that's a cousin of human beings?
Denisova.
Yeah, just but really recently, within the last few days.
Very, very recently. Well, this is the thing, you see, that our story is much more complex than we've been taught. And gradually, bit by bit, the evidence is coming out of the woodwork.
Well, the idea that we have all the data of history is just so crazy. It's just not true.
And arrogant.
It's absolutely foolish.
Yeah, it's a very foolish idea, and it shuts us down to the possibilities. I mean, the universe gifted us with these giant brains, and this incredible imagination, and intuitive faculties as well. We're not only rational creatures, we're intuitive creatures. And all of these faculties should be applied to understanding the mystery of who and what we are. And I think that's one of the mistakes of modern science, is this just chopped out one bit, the kind of alert problem-solving bit, the rational reason, use of reason and logic, and it's chopped out all the rest. The capacity of humanity to dream, to learn information in dream, to learn true knowledge in dream was revered in the ancient world and just ridiculed today. You want to insult somebody, call him a dreamer, you know. Things have changed so much.
Well, it seems like back then there was so much less information. Now there's so much information. To call someone a dreamer means that you're thinking of nonsense, when you should be trying to acquire all the information that we've already discovered, that we've already accumulated.
Exactly. That's exactly what it's about. And again, it's ideology. It's saying that there is nothing of value in dreams. How do we know that? Ancient world felt that there was useful knowledge to be got from dreams, not all dreams. It's in Homer, actually, that he speaks of the gate of ivory and the gate of horn. Some dreams come through the gate of ivory. They're just pleasant fictions, or maybe unpleasant ones, nightmares. Ignore them. They're not important. But others are true tellings, and they come through the gate of horn. And this was a recognized factor in the ancient world. We've dismissed it today. It's regarded as pseudoscience. It's regarded as nonsense. Again, that label is constantly applied to anything archaeologists don't like. Pseudoscience. Right there with the label, they just dismiss everything. They always call me a pseudoscientist, which means a false scientist. And I find that bizarre, because I'm not a scientist at all. I've never claimed to be a scientist. I don't want to be a scientist. I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. I synthesize material across a broad range of disciplines. So how can I be a false scientist, since I've never claimed to be one? But the word is used as a bludgeon or a club to beat an enemy over the head and ensure that nobody listens to what that enemy says.
Yeah, it's just sort of a bulletproof pejorative. You know, you throw that out there and you're immediately dismissed.
Yeah.
But it's got to be satisfying to you, going from that original book, which I became absolutely fascinated by, Fingerprints of the Gods, to slowly but surely, over time, more and more evidence being discovered in mainstream science and archaeology that affirms all these suspicions. And then attached to what Randall's been studying his whole life, it really, the whole thing just sort of unfolds in front of your eyes.
There's a kind of perfect moment in human knowledge unfolding right now. We now have the knowledge of this giant cataclysm that happened 12,800 years ago, which has just not been taken into account at all up to now. And at the same time, and it's almost eerie, archaeological sites are popping up all around the world that cannot be explained by the previous model of history.
Now, with all of this information that you've shown so far, the layer that shows the massive burning of the forest, the impact craters that we found, because of the fact that nuclear glass and micro diamonds, all this evidence that the immediate shift of the climate, the mass extinction of a huge percentage of the large mammals.
As I say, there is a specialized subdivision.
Is that considered in mainstream science?
Not
Or
yet.
they just,
It's considered in mainstream science because it's mainstream scientists who presented the evidence. As
all
I
the
said,
data you've accumulated in
it all
correspondence.
comes
Right.
from mainstream science, published in the absolute leading scientific journals.
But you're stitching it together.
What nobody has done yet, I think I'm probably the first person to do it, is to take that evidence and consider its implications for the stories we tell ourselves about the origins of civilization. Very important story. Where did civilization come from? What is it? And that information has not been taken into account at all by archaeologists yet. I hope they will do so in the future. They need to play a very fast game of catch up to catch up with the science on this and take it into account. But right now, it's not being taken into account at all. You will not find a single archaeological document which takes account of the cataclysm that happened between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago.
Big part of the problem is specialization in science, I think. So you've got, paleontologists looking at the extinction events. You've got, marine geologists looking at sea level rise. You've got glaciologists looking at how the glaciers disappeared. And we're in a position now where we need to begin synthesizing all of this. What's interesting to me, though, is that it almost falls on the shoulders of the mavericks, the synthesizers. And that's kind of really, right now, there's so much specialization in science that the next phase of it, I think, is beginning to integrate it, to create a coherent model of our past. Because a lot of, like Graham was saying, a lot of the mainstream scientists have this information, right? If we look at this graph right here, and you see how this compares with the graphs we just saw of the climate changes and the ocean level rise, this is as it says, late Pleistocene mortality graph. And this is basically looking at radiocarbon dated fossilized remains of the extinct mammals. And if you look carefully, you'll see that within the range that we're talking about right in here, here's your 13,000 year spike right here.
It's exactly the same time period, and exactly the same as the changing of the temperature, the rising of the sea levels, massive extinction.
Right, and there it is right there. Every one of these squares represents a fossilized remain. I think 360 or 70 specimens that have been dated.
It seems insanely unlikely to me that this didn't correspond with an impact on human civilization.
It's very clear.
It seems insane. And it's not like mainstream and concept. If this is all fact, and obviously it is, how is this not this is so glaring?
First of all, it raises a horrible possibility for archaeology that they have been completely wrong about the origins of civilization. I mean, not just slightly wrong, but completely wrong, because they didn't take account of this. That's a horrible possibility, and it's much better to just try and get rid of the data. I'm not saying that it's a conspiracy by archaeologists, I'm saying it's human nature. If you're invested in a system of ideas, so powerfully invested in it that your own personality is connected to it, you just can't accept it. It's really hard to accept. Almost your generation has to die off before a new generation comes that will be prepared to do it. Just with old age. I'm not threatening. I'm not threatening an assault on the world of archaeology.
No, you're not. I said ooh because it impacted. I think you're right.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's the problem, why it's not been taken. And Randall's right. The other problem is the intense specialization of our society. That's one of the strengths of our society. There's also one of the weaknesses of our society, that everybody is really good at one particular thing.
That's the only way it all works out, because no one could possibly get all this work done.
And we're all interdependent upon one another, but there's not enough comparing notes across the disciplines. And I guess that's where my skills, such as they are, come in, that I've spent my whole life synthesizing data from many different fields, and that's what I'm doing here.
It also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like part of the issue is there's no consequence to not considering this stuff. There's no consequence to just ignoring it. They ignore it. They teach what they taught mainstream, and they still come out smelling like a rose, and everything looks great.
Exactly, and they all keep their jobs.
Yes,
they don't annoy their colleagues.
It's almost the opposite of that, because to go here, they're actually, they're threatening their position. They're putting their position in danger.
But I don't understand why they would be, because to me it seems like you would want to say, we have some exciting data. So this is, now we have to reconsider what we already know.
Yeah.
We already know, about this part of the world, and we already know about the Pleistocene era. We already know about all these different eras, but now we have this new data to consider, and here all it is.
Yeah. They should be excited about it. They should be joyous that there's something here which really could change the whole picture. But that's not the case. It's radically opposed.
Well, it makes your education look like shit.
I mean,
it's really unfortunate, but it really does.
You see, this is an area that Randall and I to know a lot about. What I wonder is, in other areas that I don't know about, is this same phenomenon at work?
Right.
the kind of knowledge filter, which is
Like-
just shutting us off.
And what discipline would that be? Or are you just
Social,
speculating?
social sciences,
Right.
any area of science, medicine, how things are to be done with medicine, how tumors are to be handled and dealt with. You know, we have a dogma right now that it's chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and every other system is regarded as what? Pseudoscience,
Mhm.
generally. But maybe that's a mistake. You know, maybe we should be considering the possibility of these alternative therapies. Maybe they're better than blasting somebody with highly radioactive material.
Well, I certainly think there's some things that we don't know about the impact of nutrition and overall health and meditation and just the impact of stress and well-being and how it plays on health factors. And
Exactly.
I think we're going to learn all that. I mean, I think there's probably more discussion and more focus on that than there is on stuff like this.
Sure, there is. Our personal health is important to all of us, and
This is
what
it's kind of a part of our personal health
you bet
too.
it is. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a part of our understanding of the
Who we
very
are, what we
environment
are,
that we exist in.
where we came from. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, how long did you guys road trip together?
About 2 weeks, wasn't it, Randall?
Little shy of 2 weeks.
And what did it entail? Did you guys make a video of it or anything?
There was a lot of video
Yeah.
shot, and
Beautiful.
one of Randall's colleagues, Brad, who was with us, shot video along the way, and my wife Santa took photographs, and you know we've documented all of this very thoroughly. But it was an amazing road trip for me. It was the first time actually I've driven a great distance across the continental United States. I've always been in this city or that city and picking up an airplane and going here there, but actually drive across this incredible, majestic land was an enormous experience for me, and it filled me with a sense of just how huge America is. I live in this tiny island, you know, Britain, but this giant, the open skies country that they call it in there. It was a great initiation into a beautiful part of North America and a mysterious part of North America. And it was great to do it with Randall because he's been walking the walk in this area for decades, and he knows that landscape like the back of his hand.
Yeah, and for people that are listening to this podcast right now, this is your first introduction to Randall and Graham, but you got to go pause right now and go back to the first one Graham was on, the first one Randall was on. Just do a binge. Just binge listen or binge watch. What are we looking at here?
Well, this is Graham trespassing.
How dare you?
I'm watching in all
You're
directions
not
for.
supposed to be there?
Well, since the first time I was there, Graham actually referred to this erratic earlier. This was one
This
of
is
those.
that 18,000-ton boulder sitting above the notch.
So that was the boulder that was pushed by the
It was carried aboard
in
an
the
iceberg.
Yeah.
An
It's
iceberg.
shade
an iceberg.
Yeah.
So a
An
bird that was
iceberg. Yes.
this massive rush of water had giant rocks embedded in the iceberg.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
to float that, you need an iceberg about the size of an oil tanker.
Yes.
Ooh.
And this is sitting 400 feet above the modern day Columbia. So we know that the water was at least this high. Well, actually, it had to have been higher than this because 90% of the iceberg is under the surface of the water.
And how do we know that this rock just wasn't there? How do we know that it was carried by this?
Well, because it's not part of the bedrock. It's sitting on top of the land surface. Like all of these, if we look here, we've got some other.
Do we know where it came from? Do we know how far away it
Yes,
originated?
it's probably come from about 50 miles to 75 miles north of here. It's the type of basalt it is has been identified. I don't remember specifically, but when you travel over this land, you see these giant boulders just strewn about.
There's a place called Boulder Park. It's a tourist attraction now. You can go see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can see there, I mean, the size of that. And let's see.
Oh my God. So they just stand out like out of nowhere.
Yeah, and we know this had to have been transported aboard an iceberg for the simple reason that if it was carried within the glacier mass, like a typical glacier erratic, you wouldn't have those sharp square corners like that. A glacier erratic gets ground off.
Right.
And oftentimes, this thing was transported almost 200 miles from its likely origin with Mount Robeson, and we didn't get to this one.
Mhm.
But this is evidence that the flooding was much more extensive than just the Missoula flooding, because this is the Missoula flooding that we were looking at was on the west side of the North American
I think
continental divide.
I should just jump in there and say that it isn't any longer controversial that there was gigantic flooding in the Pacific Northwest and indeed across the whole range just south of the ice cap. That is accepted now. But the very idea that there was flooding at all was hotly opposed for decades. There was a great American geologist called J. Harlan Bretz, who was the first to document the fact that there had been colossal flooding in that area. And he lived in the 1900s, the 1920s. And because he suggested that there had been a cataclysm, of course, he was exiled by his colleagues. Eventually, his data prevailed, and he was awarded the Penrose Medal, the highest award of the geology in America, in 1976 when he was like 96 years old.
That must have sucked for him.
And he said then, he said, all my enemies are dead, so I have no one left to gloat over.
That's what he said. Oh my God! But it's so disturbing to me that it works like that.
Yeah, it works like that. So,
they're demonized.
But what happened, you see, was Harlan Bretz was convinced from the beginning that he was dealing, and this is a very experienced field geologist, that he was dealing with a single humongous flood, which had risen and fallen within perhaps 2 weeks. That was his evidence on the ground, and he was attacked because people kept saying, well, where did the water come from? You know, what's the source of this water? And he said, that's not my problem. I am showing you the clear, unmistakable evidence of flooding on the ground. Flooding happened. Somebody else go work out where the water came from. And this stuck the whole argument for the best part of 40 years until a compromise was reached. And that's the word that Randall used, Missoula. They said that this flooding was caused by outburst floods from a glacial lake that's referred to as Glacial Lake Missoula. And because the flooding is so extensive, it must have outburst 80 or 90 times to cause that flood, which completely contradicts Harlan Bretz's view that it was a 2-week flood.
Blue Jays.
One single event.
That's my team.
But the compromise was accepted that the cause of the flooding was Glacial Lake Missoula.
I don't know anything about it.
That is now going to have to be reviewed because of the comet evidence. If J. Harlan Bretz had the information we have today, he would have known instantly what caused that single humongous flood. And that was the liquidizing of a huge area of the North American ice cap instantly, and the floods that followed.
It's so fascinating that the obsessions of a few people come together like this, and you can kind of piece these things together on a podcast. Randall, what is this crazy image you're showing?
Well, this is actually out of the 19th century text when before catastrophism had been completely exorcised from mainstream geology. And this was Louis Figuier, I think was his name.
Not listening to the right people.
That the ice sheets over northwestern Europe had catastrophically melted down. And he had an illustration in his geology text which perfectly captures how these large erratics are actually being transported aboard these icebergs. And you can see the scale of the thing. And this is the kind of, you see whole forests are about to be washed away here. And this image, when first time I saw it, here it is. This depicts the kind of field evidence that we've been looking at here.
What? Sorry.
So that's why I've included this here, because it helps to visualize what we're talking about. We've got some this was a place that Graham and I visited here, which really spectacularly embodies this whole phenomenon. This is known as Dry Falls Cataract. And it's about 5 miles wide. And I'm going to show you ground photographs and a couple of aerial photographs of it, so you can kind of get the scale of the thing. Now,
the great thing is anybody can go there. This is on the land. It's ours to look at. We can all go and see this. It's an amazing trip to see it.
You could go there, Joe. They would let you in there to see this.
Where were you trespassing?
On that particular shot, that huge 18,000-ton boulder is surrounded by notices which say no trespassing.
They weren't there when I was there.
Don't step on it. So I trespassed. I mean, the thing is made of basalt, and my footstep is not going to do it any harm.
Yeah, I bet you nobody even noticed that Graham had been up there.
So it's not like a private property issue. It's like they're just trying to keep people.
I think it is actually a private property.
Probably is. Because I have noticed from the first time I went there, which was, 98, I think, there was no houses on that hillside. Now the houses are moving up the hillside. There's been development and so forth. There was houses pretty much right around it. So
we're going to overrun it, and there'll be no evidence. You guys got to accumulate your evidence while you can before condos go up there.
That's also
right.
True.
Now you'll notice that there's a series of these alcoves here that these horseshoe shaped.
Back on the image of Dry Falls.
But back on the image of Dry Falls, exactly. And at some point, somebody's going to be able to see these images, right?
Yeah, well, people can go and Google them online, but they'll see them right now on YouTube if they watch the YouTube version
of the show. YouTube, okay. So here's a typical Horseshoe Falls of Niagara, which is a modern cataract, receding cataract. And this horseshoe shape is very typical of the way water will erode bedrock, because water flows faster in the middle of the stream, therefore it erodes faster in the middle and not so much as you get towards the margins. And so it creates this classic horseshoe shape profile. And that's what we're seeing here at Dry Falls. Now, this is just one of the alcoves of about half a dozen of the alcoves that we saw in the map of it.
In other words, this is a monstrously big waterfall.
Yes. Now,
Dry today.
just off to the left of the picture is where, actually, and there's a photograph in Graham's book taken from, let's go back, we skipped over it. There it is. This is the viewpoint, and this is Horseshoe Falls of Niagara superimposed on Dry Falls, so you can get a sense of the scale.
So Niagara Falls is a tiny, tiny little thing
Yeah.
by comparison with this ancient fossilized waterfall, which dates back 12,800 years. Niagara Falls is the result of 12,000 or more years of work of the river. Dry Falls between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee in Washington State is the result of 2 weeks of flooding.
What?
Yeah. And
For people, try to explain this for people that are listening, because it's probably 10 times bigger plus.
more than that.
How many times bigger?
It's 2.5 times as high. And well, figure this, the discharge of the Niagara River over the falls is a couple 100,000 cubic feet per second maximum. The discharge over Grand Coulee was somewhere between 300 and 400 million cubic feet per second, or in other words, somewhere between 10 and 20 times the combined flow of every river on Earth flowing all at once. And the height of this scarp face here, this cliff, is about 400 feet.
Oh my
The
God.
water coming over was about 400 feet deep. So if you were here, witnessing this at the peak of the flood, you wouldn't in fact even see a waterfall. What you would see is this massive 10-mile wide turgid river choked with icebergs and debris and whole forests
And
that
that
had
river
been
is
ripped
around
up.
flowing at what, 60, 70 miles an hour?
60, 70 miles an hour. What you would have seen here was just a bump in this flood. And then only at the latter stages of it would it actually have been a waterfall. As the water source was dissipating and as the water was declining, you would have the final stage of it being a waterfall. Then eventually the waterfall stopped. And what you have today is this fossilized feature, this massive, and this is only one of about a half a dozen comparable sized cataracts. We didn't get to see potholes or Frenchman Coulee next time, perhaps.
So many others. I'd
Yeah.
urge anybody listening to this, if you can do so, get up to Washington State and go visit Upper and Lower Grand Coulee. It's a stunning landscape. It's a great trip to make, and you can see the evidence on the ground.
And people don't know about it. We like here. This is Utah, and what you see here is once you begin to understand the cataract formation, and you understand the morphology of a cataract, you look at something like this, and what you're looking at is cataracts, extinct cataracts out in Canyonlands, Utah, and they're massively scaled. But no geologists. See, here's the problem: geologists haven't been focused on catastrophism. What they've been doing, they work for the government, they work for the oil companies. They're more interested in what's down below, the natural gas, the oil and
That's where the
stuff.
money is.
There's another
Yeah.
point. There's another point I'd like to add to that, Randall, as to
Yeah.
why geology is science, and science in effect defined itself as being different from religious superstition. So the notion of the Great Flood that we find in the Bible became a very discredited notion in science, and by association with that, any suggestion of a great cataclysm in the past was seen as superstitious behavior, to be shunned completely by the squeaky clean, shiny new sciences, who must never take that into account. So any geologist who dares to propose a cataclysmic episode is up against that right away. That his colleagues don't want to go there because they're afraid that they're going to be accused of buying into Noah's flood or whatever.
That's so unfortunate.
But it's true, and this is the problem. So there's catastrophism and uniformitarianism, and the prevailing dogma in geology is the uniformitarian dogma, which is basically to say the way we see things in the world today, that's how it's always been.
Mhm.
It's
That's
never
exactly
been
it.
any change.
So, Randall, what is the mainstream understanding of those those formations? Like when they look at those
The Utah ones, for example.
gigantic Utah,
I have searched and searched and I find nothing.
they just don't explain it.
They don't
They
explain
just
it.
go, oh, look how pretty.
Do you think
Yeah.
the flooding went as far south as Utah?
Not directly glacial. I think what we're looking there has to be torrential rain.
Right.
Torrential,
Which is another association of this impact.
Yes.
Picture this huge impacts on the ice cap. An enormous amount of watery material is thrown up into the atmosphere. Not only water, but also mud, and you get this rain out,
Yeah.
which comes down for a long period after that.
And I'm not necessarily saying that all of that was stripped in one, because the Pleistocene is basically 2.5 million years. I think 2.6 million is the latest dating of it. And there's been probably a dozen or 24 ice ages that have come and gone. To me, the evidence I'm seeing suggests that the transition from glacial to interglacial and back again is not a smooth process. In fact, it's probably highly catastrophic. Not necessarily as catastrophic as the event we're talking about 12,800 years ago, but certainly catastrophic enough that were an event of equivalent magnitude to happen today, we could maybe not cause a mass extinction, but we could certainly pull the plug on modern civilization. And so this picture is interesting because what it does is it shows that, you know, you travel over this landscape.
Explain what this picture is and where.
Okay, you know, now this is in western Montana, and this is a place called Dry Creek. And what this is just a gravel pit. But what you see here is deposits caused by surging floodwaters moving up tributary valleys, loaded with sediment. And one of the things that a stratigrapher or a sedimentologist looks at is, you notice how they're tilted. You see how the layers are tilted?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's an indication of which direction the water is moving. The tilting goes down in the direction that the water is flowing. So what we see here is massive, turbulent, sediment-laden floodwaters back flooding up a valley, surging, leaving deposits, and then flowing back out, followed by another wave, For 13,000 years, 12,000 years, this material has been laying there, and you see that there's forests growing over it.
Mm.
Okay, people traveling over this landscape don't see what's under their feet, you see.
Mm.
But once you get an outcrop like this, and you understand and you can read what you're seeing here, then suddenly it becomes apparent that the very hills and landscape that we live on, that we built our cities on, and our highways, and that we're playing out all these dramas, that right under our feet is the evidence of previous worlds. You have to understand that what you're looking at there is the debris of a former world that was pulverized by these floods, carried in and deposited, and now a new world has emerged out of that and on top of this wreckage,
And in that
room.
former world existed, I believe, an advanced civilization that is memorized in myths and traditions all around the world, that is being ridiculed by archaeologists, but it is insistent, and the evidence keeps on coming forward.
Well, it all makes sense. It really does. It's all shocking and stunning and fantastic, but it all makes sense.
I think it does make sense, and I think it's something. It's part of the human heritage. It's something that we all have to get to grips with. Again, this is one of the things I find encouraging about developments in the world today, is that more and more people do appear to be thinking for themselves. You know, there was a time when we took the word of specialists. Dr. X or Professor Y said this, and it had to be true. And that was so actually when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. That was the first argument, was the argument from authority. The authorities say this cannot be so, therefore it is not so. And a lot of people just bought that. What's changed, I think, in the last 20 years is that subservience to authority has gone away. It hasn't gone away completely, but we don't trust authority anymore, rightly and properly,
because we've been lied to by authority figures, and we know they lied to us, and we saw the evidence, whether it's politicians or big corporations or or the big religions. There's an uprising against this and an assertion of individual will and of individual intellect to inquire into the past. And I think that's why this information now is coming at a time where it's falling on fertile ground. There will still be a lot of resistance to it. We can expect that resistance to be fierce and to go on. But things are shifting in the world, just as our picture of the past is shifting. So our picture of who we are and what we're meant to be doing here is shifting as well.
Have you guys thought about coming together and doing a documentary?
I'd love to do a documentary around it.
You guys together, it's a must do. I mean, it just seems like the book is, I'm sure, going to be fantastic, but there's going to be people that are just not going to read a book. The documentaries are so easy. All you just do is open your stupid mouth, lay down, turn on Netflix, and bam, you can absorb it. Whereas
it might happen.
people are lazy.
It's highly visual material, and
So visual.
And
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's so visual, and the two of you together. We need to crowdfund something.
Can I make it appeal? It's the first time I've ever done this. It's a kind of little
Please do.
pitch. It's a little
pitch?
Okay, I've never asked for this before.
Okay.
What I'm asking to those who value and appreciate my work and feel that I'm doing something useful in the world, please support my work by getting this book, because that is the best way to put one finger up to the mainstream. Archaeology wants this book to go away. They want it to be forgotten. It will never be reviewed in any mainstream newspaper. It will never be written about. There will be no articles about it, and probably no television coverage either. The only thing that
Seems like a book to own, man.
voting with their feet.
You should own the book.
People
Well,
value my work.
People
I
are
can't
huge,
buy it. I
huge
don't have any
fans
money,
of
but
your
you should own
appearances
that book.
here, and huge,
You
huge
like
fans
books.
of your work, and
Because that will
this
become
is-
rare.
This is the latest and greatest. I'm sure people are going to go out and buy it in droves. So, Magicians of the Gods, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on your website. You can get it pretty much everywhere.
Yeah,
right?
go to my website, and all the links and the whole background on the book is there.
Maybe everybody's
I
interested.
usually-
Who knows?
I appreciate,
Who knows?
deeply
Maybe.
appreciate the support
Maybe.
my readers have given me. I would be nothing without my readers. That's why every time I do an event, I sit there for 2 to 3 hours afterwards talking to people and signing books, because the readers are the most important people in my universe, and they're who give me strength. Without my readers, I'm literally nothing, and I value and appreciate them. And I'm on a journey across America now. I'm speaking in many different cities, and the whole program is up on my website on the talks and events
Well,
page.
we'll make sure we tweet that stuff and get that information out, and I'll get that information out for the entirety of the time you're here. Just let me know where you're going to be, and I'll let everybody know
I will.
when you're going to be there.
Since we're plugging, I'd like to plug. I got this.
What is that?
Well, it's about a 4.5 hour presentation.
Of course it
Chock full
is.
of graphics, video clips, animations.
And it's all you.
Yeah.
And what is it? What's it called?
Cosmic Patterns and Cycles of Catastrophe.
Wow.
And we can go to the Sacred Geometry International website. I think Cameron Wilshire, who who introduced us, has I think he's doing a special on it now.
Okay.
33% off or something.
So
It's a
what
good
is the
deal.
actual URL of the website?
Well, it would be sacredgeometryinternational.com.
There it is. Jamie's pulled it up right there. So Cosmic Patterns and Cycles of Catastrophe.
Yes.
33.33% off. What is that all about?
You'll have to ask Cameron about that.
There's some hidden numerology in there somewhere.
Apparently. And you'll notice coupon code, Magicians.
Ah, there you go. Magicians of the Gods.
That must be a reference.
I think it probably corresponds. So I really think that you guys have to do one of these things together as a documentary. I mean, I think it's just, I think someone out there, someone's listening to this, probably some kooks that we don't want doing this documentary, but there's got to be somebody out there that's legit. We just need to find them and put it together.
Yeah, I want to pay tribute to Randall's work. Randall is a really important figure in this field, and he's very modest, and he's been standing back, and he's not been out there enough. It's time that people understood the fantastic knowledge that this man has, and the ground experience. You can't beat that.
Well, I met Randall in it was early 2000s, right?
When you were at the Punchline.
Yeah, in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Which doesn't even exist anymore. It's
Close to
gone
10
now.
years ago, I think.
It was quite a while ago,
Yeah.
and we had this conversation after my show, and we were just sitting there. It was talk to me about the policy and all the different impacts. And I remember walking away from that. We were talking for quite a while after the show. And I remember going, that might be the craziest fucking post-show conversation I've ever had. Because usually, after a comedy show, you have a conversation with people, hey, where's a good place to eat? Do you like Atlanta? Like normal stuff. And he's just flooding me with information. I'm like, who is this guy?
Well, I remember walking away from it going, wow, I had no idea that Joe Rogan really related to all this stuff.
I met Smith Mulder and I didn't have a credit score.
I mean, something there,
It's
which
got
is
a
I'd
proof
like
for
to say something
Carlo
about you, Joe.
of $50,000
It's a phenomenon.
on a credit
I
score of
travel all around the
425.
world and I give presentations in just countries everywhere.
Absolutely.
And everywhere I go,
Yeah.
people come up to me and they say, Joe Rogan sent us to you. We know about your work because of Joe Rogan. And I see that what you're doing is exploring many, many controversial areas in your show. You're in a position of power, and your listeners, just as my readers are my strength, your listeners are your strength. They put you in a position of power, but you're a person who's using that power for something really good. There are so many people who are powerful in the world of the media who just waste it away on trivia and nothing. You are bringing new information to people all around the world. And I can tell you, because I meet them every time I give an event, you're enormously appreciated.
Well, I appreciate them very much. And I appreciate you guys, and I appreciate this show, because this whole thing came about without any planning. This show just sort of became itself. It's almost like I was just happen to be there to germinate it or something.
But you have from Enclosure
tried to
C.
get out of my
That's
own
the
way
beginning,
as much
as far as you've been able to establish it up
follow
to
my
now.
curiosity. And
The beginning of the
beautiful thing
monumental
about
phase,
people
yes.
like you.
There's a glint in the professor's eye. And 9,600 BC is an important date. It isn't just a number. It's the end of the Ice Age. It's a global phenomenon. So since this goes in parallel, the date Schmidt is putting such emphasis on rings a sudden bell in my mind relating to other research I've been doing, and I feel compelled to interrupt. 9,600 BC, that's not just the end of the Ice Age, it's the end of the Younger Dryas cold spell that starts in 10,800 BC and ends in 9,620 BC, Schmidt continues, according to the ice cores from Greenland. So how likely is it to be an accident that the monumental phase at Göbekli Tepe starts in 9,600 BC, when the climate of the whole world has taken a sudden turn for the better, and there's an explosion in nature and in possibilities? I can only agree. It doesn't seem likely that it's an accident at all. On the contrary, I feel certain there must be a connection. We'll explore that connection and the mysterious cataclysmic period that geologists call the Younger Dryas, and what those Greenland ice cores tell us in part 2.
Good pizza.
Meanwhile, back in 2013, I closed my interview with Klaus Schmidt with some praise. And in December 2014, as I sit at my desk, going through the transcript of the recording I made at Göbekli Tepe, and knowing that Klaus died of a massive, unexpected heart attack on 20 July 2014, I'm glad I did so. You're a very humble man, I say. But the fact is, you've discovered a site that has caused all of us to rethink our ideas of the past. This is a remarkable thing, and I believe that your name, as well as the name of Göbekli Tepe, will go down in history. The bringers of civilization. After leaving Göbekli Tepe in mid-September 2013, I make an extensive journey through the length and breadth of Turkey before I finally return home. The Lion Pillar sticks in my mind. But what particularly haunts me is the scene on pillar number 43 in Enclosure D. The scene showing the vulture with its bent human-like knees and its wing that so much resembles an arm, holding up a solid disc. I download Santa's photographs onto my computer and call up that scene.
Yeah.
It has many remarkable elements as well as the disc. Both wings of the vulture are shown, I now realize. The other stretched out behind its body. To the right of the vulture is a serpent. It has a large triangular head, as do all serpents depicted at Göbekli Tepe, and its body is coiled into a curve, with its tail extending down towards an H-shaped pictogram. Serpent is nestled close to another large bird, not a vulture, but something more like an ibis with a long, sickle-shaped beak. Between it and the vulture is yet another bird, again
great.
with a hooked beak, but
awesome.
smaller, with the look of a chick. I turn
Oh,
my
hello,
attention
still
to the
there?
disc.
I don't know what to make of it, but the obvious guess from its shape is that it's meant to represent the sun. There's something else that interests me more, however, if I can just put my finger on what it is. Something evocative, something hauntingly familiar about the imagery of this ancient pillar from Göbekli Tepe. Santa has shot hundreds of frames of it from every possible angle, and obsessively I keep going through them, hoping for some clue. The vulture, the disc, and in the next register above the vulture, that weird row of bags with their curved handles. Bags. Handbags. Suddenly I get it. I go to the shelf in my library where I keep reference copies of my own books, and pull out Fingerprints of the Gods and start leafing through the photo sections. The first section deals with South America, and what I'm looking for isn't there. But the second section is devoted to Mexico, and on the 5th page, I find it. It's image number 33 with the caption, Man in Serpent Sculpture from the Olmec site of La Venta. It's Santa's photograph taken way back in 1992 or 1993 of an impressive relief carved on a slab of solid granite measuring about 1.2 meters, 4 feet wide, and 1.5 meters, 5 feet high. The relief features what is believed to be the earliest representation of the Central American deity whom the Maya, a later civilization than the Olmecs, would call Kukulkan or Gukumats, and who was known by the even later Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl. All three names mean feathered serpent, sometimes translated as plumed serpent. And it is such a serpent, decorated with a prominent feathered crest on its head, that we see here. Its powerful body coils sinuously around the outer edge of the relief, cradling the figure of a man who is depicted in a seated position, as though he's reaching for pedals with his feet. In his right hand, he's holding what I described at the time as a small, bucket-shaped object. I return to Santa's images from Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, and am immediately able to confirm what I suspected. The 3 bags on the pillar closely resemble the bucket-shaped object from La Venta in Mexico. The same curved handle is there in both cases, and the profile of the bags and of the bucket, slightly wider at the bottom than at the top, is also very similar. If that were all there was to it, this would surely be a coincidence. The Man in Serpent relief from La Venta is thought by archaeologists to date to the period between the 10th and the 6th centuries BC, about 9,000 years younger than the imagery from Göbekli Tepe. So how could there possibly be a connection? That's when I remember a second curious image I reproduced in Fingerprints of the Gods. I checked the index for the name Oannes, turn to chapter 11, and find another figure of a man carrying a bag or bucket. I hadn't noticed the resemblance between it and Man in Serpent before, but it's obvious to me now. Although not absolutely identical, both bags have the same curved handle that is also depicted on the Göbekli Tepe pillar. Quickly, I scanned through the report I wrote 20 years earlier. Oannes was a civilizing hero, revered by all the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia. He was said to have appeared there in the remotest antiquity, and to have taught the inhabitants the skills necessary for writing and for doing mathematics and for all sorts of knowledge, how to build cities, found temples, make laws, determine borders and divide land, also how to plant seeds and then to harvest their fruits and vegetables. In short, he taught men all those things conducive to a civilized life. The fullest account we have of Oannes is found in surviving fragments of the works of a Babylonian priest called Berosus, who wrote in the 3rd century BC. Fortunately, I have a translation of all the Berosus fragments in one volume in my library, so I dig it out, along with a few other sources on ancient Mesopotamian myths and traditions. It doesn't take me long to discover that Oannes did not do his work alone, but was supposedly the leader of a group of beings known as the 7 Apkallu, the 7 sages, who were said to have lived before the flood. A cataclysmic global deluge features prominently in many Mesopotamian traditions, including those of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon. Alongside Oannes, these sages are portrayed as bringers of civilization who, in the most ancient past, gave humanity a moral code, arts, crafts, and agriculture, and taught them architectural, building, and engineering skills. That's a list, I can't help thinking,
that includes all the skills supposedly invented at Göbekli Tepe. I call up a map on my computer screen and see that not only does southeastern Turkey adjoin Mesopotamia geographically, but also that the two areas are linked in an even more intimate and direct way. Largely occupied today by the modern state of Iraq, the ancient name Mesopotamia means literally land between rivers. The rivers in question being the Tigris and the Euphrates, which reach the sea in the Persian Gulf, but which both have their headwaters in the same Taurus mountain range of southeastern Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe is situated. While I'm online, I run some searches for images of the Seven Sages. I don't get many hits at first, but the moment I change the search terms to Apkallu and Seven Apkallu, I open a colossal archive of images from all over the internet, many of them reliefs from Assyria, a culture that thrived in Mesopotamia from approximately 2500 BC to about 600 BC. I add Assyrian Apkallu to the search parameters, and even more images flood my screen. Often they show bearded men holding bags or buckets, which closely resemble those depicted on the Göbekli Tepe pillar and the one held by the Mexican man in serpent figure. It's not just the curved handles of these containers or their shape, where the resemblance is much closer than on the original Oannes relief I reproduced in Fingerprints of the Gods. Even more striking is the peculiar and distinctive way that the figures from both Mesopotamia and Mexico hold these containers with the fingers of the hands turned inwards and the thumb crooked forwards over the handle. There's something else as well. A good number of the images show not a man, but a therianthrope, a bird man, with a hooked beak exactly like the hooked beak of the therianthrope on the Göbekli Tepe pillar. What makes the resemblance even closer is that in the Mesopotamian reliefs, the bird man is holding the container in one hand and a cone-shaped object in the other. The shape is a little different, but a comparison with the disc cradled above the wing of the Göbekli Tepe bird man is hard to resist. I can't prove anything yet. It could, of course, all be coincidence, or I could be imagining links that aren't there. But my curiosity is aroused by the similar containers on different continents in different epochs. And so I jot down a series of questions that can form the frame of a loose hypothesis for future testing. For instance, could these containers, whether they're bags or buckets, be the symbols of office of an initiatic brotherhood, far-traveled and deeply ancient, with roots reaching back into the remotest prehistory? I feel that this possibility, extraordinary though it may seem on the face of things, is worth looking into, and is strengthened by the distinctive hand postures. Might these not have served the same sort of function as Masonic handshakes today, providing an instant means of identifying who is an insider and who is not? And what might have been the purpose of such a brotherhood? Curiously enough, in both Mexico and Mesopotamia, where myths and traditions have survived in connection with the imagery and symbolism, we are left in no doubt as to what the purpose was. Stated simply, it was to teach, to guide, and to spread the benefits of civilization. This, after all, was the explicit function of Oannes and the Apkallu sages, who taught the inhabitants of Mesopotamia how to plant seeds and then to harvest their fruits and vegetables, agriculture in other words, and who also taught them architectural and engineering skills, notably the building of temples. If they needed to be taught these things, then they must have had no knowledge of them before the arrival of the sages. They must, in other words, have been nomadic hunter-gatherers, just as the inhabitants of southeastern Turkey were until the sudden and surprising entry onto the world stage of Göbekli Tepe. The same, it transpires, was believed to be the case with the ancient inhabitants of Mexico before the arrival of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who came to teach them the benefits of settled agriculture and the skills necessary to build temples.
Amazing.
Although this deity is frequently depicted as a serpent, he is more often shown in human form, the serpent being his symbol and his alter ego, and is usually described as a tall, bearded, white man, a mysterious person, a white man with a strong formation of body, broad forehead, large eyes, and a flowing beard. Indeed, as Sylvanus Griswold Morley, the doyen of Mayan studies, concluded, the attributes and life history of Quetzalcoatl are so human that it is not improbable that he may have been an actual historical character.
the memory of whose benefactions lingered after his death, and whose personality was eventually deified. The same could very well be said of Oannes, and just like Oannes at the head of the Apkallu, likewise depicted as prominently bearded, it seems that Quetzalcoatl traveled with his own brotherhood of sages and magicians. We learned that they arrived in Mexico from across the sea in a boat that moved by itself without paddles, and that Quetzalcoatl was regarded as having been the founder of cities, the framer of laws, and the teacher of the calendar. The 16th century Spanish chronicler, Bernardino de Sahagún, who was fluent in the language of the Aztecs and took great care to record their ancient traditions accurately, tells us further that Quetzalcoatl was a great civilizing agent who entered Mexico at the head of a band of strangers. He imported the arts into the country and especially fostered agriculture. He built spacious and elegant houses and inculcated a type of religion which fostered peace. So in summary, as well as a complex pattern of shared symbols and iconography, Quetzalcoatl and Oannes shared the same civilizing mission, which they delivered in widely separated regions of the world, in an epoch that is always described as being very far back in time, remote, antediluvian, and hoary with age.
Wow.
Could it have been as far back as 9,600 BC, the epoch of Göbekli Tepe, where many of the same symbols are found, and where, although we have no surviving legends, the signs of a civilizing mission in the form of the sudden appearance of agriculture and monumental architecture are everywhere to be seen? The implications, should I ever be able to prove this hypothesis, are stunning. At the very least, it would mean that some as yet unknown and unidentified people somewhere in the world had already mastered all the arts and attributes of a high civilization more than 12,000 years ago in the depths of the last ice age, and had sent out emissaries around the world to spread the benefits of their knowledge. Who might these shadowy emissaries have been? These sages, these magicians of the gods, as I was already beginning to think of them. And why was there this insistent connection to the date of 9,600 BC? For as Klaus Schmidt rightly pointed out as he showed me round Göbekli Tepe under the baking sun of the Taurus Mountains, 9,600 BC is indeed an important date. Important not only because it marks the end of the Ice Age, but for another rather surprising reason as well. The Greek lawmaker Solon visited Egypt in 600 BC, and there he was told a very extraordinary story by the priests of the Temple of Sais in the Nile Delta, a story that was eventually handed down to his more famous descendant Plato, who in due course shared it with the world in his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias. It is, of course, the story of the great lost civilization called Atlantis, swallowed up by flood and earthquake in a single terrible day and night, 9,000 years before the time of Solon, or in our calendar, in 9,600 BC. Chapter 2, The Mountain of Light. Everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization may be wrong, says Danny Hillman Natwajaja, PhD, senior geologist with the Research Center for Geotechnology at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Old stories about Atlantis and other great lost civilizations of prehistory, long dismissed as myths by archaeologists, look set to be proved true. It's December 2013. We're in Banjo Regency, about 900 meters, 2,950 feet above sea level, and 70 kilometers, 43 miles, west of the city of Bandung on the island of Java, Indonesia. I'm climbing with Dr. Natwajaja up the steep slope of a 110-meter, 360-foot high step pyramid, set amidst a magical landscape of volcanoes, mountains, and jungles, interspersed with paddy fields and tea plantations. In 1914, lying scattered amongst the dense trees and undergrowth that then covered the summit of the pyramid, ancient man-made structures formed from blocks of columnar basalt were first shown to archaeologists. Local people held the site to be sacred and called it Gunung Padang, the name it still goes by today,
often mistranslated as mountain field by those unaware that the language of this area is not Indonesian but Sundanese, in which Gunung Padang means mountain of light or mountain of enlightenment. The structures were found to be arranged across 5 terraces with a combined area of about 150 meters, 492 feet long, by 40 meters, 131 feet wide. The visiting archaeologists were told that the terraces had been used as a place of meditation and retreat since time immemorial. And again, this remains true today. However, neither the archaeologists nor apparently the locals realized the pyramid was a pyramid. It was believed to be a natural hill, somewhat modified by human activity, until Natawijaja and his team began a geophysical survey here in 2011 using ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and seismic tomography. By then, the summit had long since been cleared, and the structures on the terraces recognized as works of megalithic architecture. But no radiocarbon dating had yet been done, and the age attributed to the site, about 1000 BC, was based on guesswork rather than on excavations. The first scientific radiocarbon dating was done by Natawijaja himself on organic materials in soils underlying the megalith at or near the surface. The dates produced, around 500 to 1500 BC, were close enough to the archaeological guesswork to cause no controversy. But a surprise was in store as Natawijaja and his team extended their investigation using tubular drills that brought up cores of earth and stone from much deeper levels. First, the drill cores contained evidence, fragments of worked columnar basalt, that more man-made megalithic structures lay far beneath the surface. Secondly, the organic materials brought up in the drill cores began to yield older and older dates, 3000 BC to 5000 BC, then 9600 BC as the drills bit deeper, then around 11,000 BC, then 15,000 BC, and finally at depths of 27.5 meters, 90 feet and more, an astonishing sequence of dates of 20,000 BC to 22,000 BC and earlier. This was not at all what my colleagues in the world of archaeology expected or wanted to hear, says Natawijaja, a world-renowned expert in the geology of megathrust earthquakes, who earned his PhD at Caltech in the United States and who, it becomes apparent, regards archaeology as a thoroughly unscientific discipline. A truly cataclysmic period. The problem is that those dates, going back before 9600 BC, take us deep into the last ice age, when Indonesia was not a series of islands as it is today, but was part of a vast antediluvian Southeast Asian continent dubbed Sundaland by geologists. Sea level was 122 meters, 400 feet lower then. Huge ice caps, 3.2 kilometers, 2 miles deep, covered most of Europe and North America until the ice caps began to melt. Then all the water stored in them returned to the oceans, and sea level rose, submerging many parts of the world where humans had previously lived. Thus Britain was joined to Europe during the Ice Age. There was no English Channel or North Sea. Likewise, there was no Red Sea, no Persian Gulf. Sri Lanka was joined to southern India. Siberia was joined to Alaska. Australia was joined to New Guinea, and so on and so forth. It was during this epoch of sea level rise, sometimes slow and continuous, sometimes rapid and cataclysmic, that the Ice Age continent of Sundaland was submerged, with only the Malaysian Peninsula and the Indonesian islands as we know them today, high enough to remain above water. As we saw in the last chapter, the established archaeological view of the state of human civilization until the end of the last Ice Age is that our ancestors were primitive hunter-gatherers, ignorant of agriculture, and incapable of any architectural feats bigger than wigwams and bivouacs. This is why Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is so significant, because it breaks that paradigm wide open and cries out for serious consideration of a possibility, previously relegated to the lunatic fringe, that civilization might be much older and more mysterious than we thought. With the date of its foundation presently set at 9600 BC, exactly 9600 BC, as Klaus Schmidt was at pains to point out to me, Göbekli Tepe also requires us to reopen the cold case of Atlantis, which archaeologists have long ridiculed, pouring scorn and derision on anyone daring to utter the much reviled A word. As noted at the end of the last chapter, the Greek philosopher Plato, whose dialogues Timaeus and Critias contain the earliest surviving mention of the fabled sunken kingdom, sets the catastrophic destruction and submergence of Atlantis by floods and earthquakes at 9,000 years before the time of Solon, i.e., exactly 9,600 BC. The Greeks could not have known of Göbekli Tepe, let alone that it was mysteriously founded at the very moment Atlantis was said to have died. Moreover, they had no access to the Greenland ice cores dating the end of the Ice Age to 9,620 BC, just 20 years before the foundation of Göbekli Tepe, nor to modern scientific knowledge about the rapidly rising sea levels, often accompanied by cataclysmic earthquakes as the weight of the melting ice caps was removed from the continental land masses that occurred in this period. With all this in mind, therefore, the date Plato gives is, to say the least, an uncanny coincidence. In Danny Nataraja's view, however, it is no coincidence at all. His research at Gunung Padang has convinced him that Plato was right about the existence of a high civilization in the depths of the last ice age, a civilization that was indeed brought to a cataclysmic end, involving floods and earthquakes, in an epoch of great global instability between 10,800 BC and 9,600 BC. This epoch, which geologists call the Younger Dryas, has long been recognized as mysterious and tumultuous. In 10,800 BC, when it began, the Earth had been emerging from the Ice Age for roughly 10,000 years. Global temperatures were rising steadily, and the ice caps were melting. Then there was a sudden, dramatic return to colder conditions, nearly as cold as at the peak of the Ice Age 21,000 years ago. This short, sharp deep freeze lasted for 1,200 years until 9,600 BC, when the warming trend resumed.
Wow.
Global temperatures shot up again, and the remaining ice caps melted very suddenly, dumping all the water they contained into the oceans. It is difficult, Nataraja says, for us to imagine what life on Earth must have been like during the Younger Dryas. It was a truly cataclysmic period of immense climate instability and terrible, indeed terrifying global conditions. It's not surprising that many large animal species, such as the mammoths, went extinct during this precise time. And of course, it had huge effects on our ancestors, not just those primitive hunter-gatherers the archaeologists speak of, but also, I believe, a high civilization that was wiped from the historical record by the upheavals of the Younger Dryas. A controversial pyramid. What has brought Nataraja to this radical view is the evidence he and his team have uncovered at Gunung Padang. When their drill cores began to yield very ancient carbon dates from organic materials embedded in clays, filling the gaps between worked stones, they expanded their investigation using geophysical equipment, ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and electrical resistivity to get a picture of what lay under the ground. The results were stunning, showing layers of massive construction using the same megalithic elements of columnar basalt that are found on the surface, but with courses of huge basaltic rocks beneath them, extending down to 30 meters, 100 feet and more beneath the surface. At those depths, the carbon dates indicate that the megaliths were put in place more than 12,000 years ago, and in some cases, as far back as 24,000 years ago. Columnar basalt does form naturally. The famous Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland is an example. But at Gunung Padang, it has been used as a building material and is laid out in a form never found in nature. The geophysical evidence is unambiguous, Nataraja says. Gunung Padang is not a natural hill, but a man-made pyramid, and the origins of construction here go back long before the end of the last ice age. Since the work is massive, even at the deepest levels, and bears witness to the kinds of sophisticated, construction skills were deployed to build the pyramids of Egypt or the largest megalithic sites of Europe, I can only conclude that we're looking at the work of a lost civilization, and a fairly advanced one. The archaeologists won't like that, I point out. They don't, Natawijaja agrees with a rueful smile. I've already got myself into a lot of hot water with this. My case is a solid one, based on good scientific evidence, but it's not an easy one. I'm up against deeply entrenched beliefs. The next step will be a full-scale archaeological excavation. We have to excavate in order to interrogate our remote sensing data and our carbon dating sequences, and either confirm or deny what we believe we found here, says Natawijaja. But unfortunately, there's a lot of obstacles in our way. When I ask what he means by obstacles, he replies that some senior Indonesian archaeologists are lobbying the government in Jakarta to prevent him from doing any further work at Gunung Padang on the grounds that they know the site is less than 3,000 years old and see no justification for disturbing it. I don't deny that the megaliths at the surface are less than 3,000 years old, Natawijaja hastens to add, but I suggest they were put here because Gunung Padang has been recognized as a sacred place since time immemorial. It's the deepest layers of the structure between 12,000 and more than 20,000 years old that are the most important. They have potentially revolutionary implications for our understanding of history, and I think it's vital that we be allowed to investigate them properly. Atlantis. Happily, there was a decisive presidential intervention during 2014, and I can now report that Danny, I'll use his first name henceforth as we have become friends, was given carte blanche to excavate the site. He and his team began work in August 2014, completing a short season there between August and October. But as the experience at Göbekli Tepe shows, painstaking, detailed archaeology is a slow process, and they do not expect to reach the deepest layers until 2017 or 2018. As the first season neared its end, however, Danny emailed me an update. The research progress has been great. We have excavated 3 more spots right on top of the megalithic site in the past couple of weeks, which give more evidence and detail about the buried structures. We have uncovered lots more stone artifacts from the excavations. The existence of the pyramid-like structure beneath the megalithic site is now loud and clear. Even for non-specialists, it's not too difficult to understand if they come and see for themselves. We have found some kind of open hall buried by soil 5 to 7 meters thick. However, we've not yet got into the main chamber. We are now drilling to the suspected location of the chamber based on subsurface geophysics in the middle of the megalithic site. Buried structures. Chambers. Ah, yes, I forgot to mention those. We'll go into the implications of all this in more detail in a later chapter, but in brief, the geophysical survey work that Danny and his team did between 2011 and 2013, deploying the latest technologies in electrical resistivity, seismic tomography, ground-penetrating radar, and core drilling, revealed not only deeply buried massive constructions and very ancient carbon dates at Gunung Padang, but also the presence of 3 further hidden and as yet unexcavated chambers, so rectilinear in form that they're most unlikely to be natural. The largest of these lies at a depth of between 21.3 and 27.4 meters, 70 to 90 feet, and measures approximately 5.5 meters, 18 feet high, 13.7 meters, 45 feet long, and 9.1 meters, 30 feet wide. Could it be the fabled Hall of Records of Atlantis? Danny has put his impeccable scientific credentials on the line with controversial claim that it might be. Not only does he refuse to scoff at the idea of Atlantis, but also he's written a book arguing that Indonesia, or rather the huge areas of Sunda land that were drowned by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, might actually be Atlantis. Danny and I made an extensive research trip around the whole of the Indonesian archipelago in June 2014, searching out megalithic sites off the beaten track that have never been properly studied by archaeologists. In Chapter 18, I'll describe our findings and how they relate to the Gunung Padang mystery. But meanwhile, I want to report here on the opinion of Dr. Robert Schock, professor of geology at Boston University, who was with me in December 2013 when I first met Danny at Gunung Padang. The view of Professor Robert Schoch. Schoch is a renowned figure, indeed notorious, for the case he's made based on strict geological evidence that the Great Sphinx of Giza bears the unmistakable erosion patterns of thousands of years of heavy rainfall. This means it has to be much older than 2500 BC, the Orthodox date, when Egypt received no more rain than it does today, and must originally have been carved around the end of the Ice Age, when the Nile Valley was subjected to a long period of intense precipitation. A tall, rangy, scholarly man with a full beard and a mop of unruly hair, Schoch was in his element at Gunung Padang, carefully interrogating the results of the geophysical scans with Danny, collecting samples and minutely examining the site. Afterwards, when he'd returned to the US and had time to analyze the data, he wrote, "The first important observation is that Gunung Padang goes back to before the end of the last ice age, circa 9700 BC. Based on the evidence, I believe that human use of the site began by circa 14,700 BC. Possibly the earliest use of the site goes back to 22,000 BC, or even earlier. In my assessment, Layer 3, some 4 to 10 meters, 13.1 to 32.8 feet or so below the surface, includes the period of the very end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 to 9,500 BC, when major climatic changes took place, with dramatic global warming, rising sea levels, torrential rains, increased earthquake and volcanic activity, widespread wildfires, and other catastrophes occurring across the surface of the Earth. There is evidence of collapsed structures in Layer 3, possibly the result of the tumultuous conditions of that time. Visiting Gunung Padang, pondering the dates and evidence of collapse and rebuilding that may have occurred here, I could not help but think about another major site representing very ancient civilization that spans the end of the last ice age, namely Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. I also think of Egypt and my own work on redating the Great Sphinx, the extreme weathering and erosion seen on the Proto-Sphinx. The head was recarved and the monument reused during dynastic times, caused by torrential rains, could have been a result of the extreme climatic changes at the end of the last ice age. Putting together the evidence of Gunung Padang with that derived from Göbekli Tepe, the Sphinx of Egypt, and other sites and lines of data from around the world, I believe we're coming closer to understanding the cataclysmic times and events at the end of the last ice age. Genuine civilizations of a sophisticated nature existed prior to circa 9700 BC, which were devastated by the events that brought the last ice age to a close. Looking for the smoking gun. At 6,000 or more years older than the stone circles of Stonehenge, the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, like the deeply buried megaliths of Gunung Padang, mean that the timeline of history taught in our schools and universities for the best part of the last 100 years can no longer stand. It is beginning to look as though civilization, as I argued in my controversial 1995 bestseller, Fingerprints of the Gods, is indeed much older and much more mysterious than we thought. In essence, what I proposed in that book was that an advanced civilization had been wiped out and lost to history in a global cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. I suggested there were survivors who settled at various locations around the world and attempted to pass on their superior knowledge, including knowledge of agriculture and architecture, to hunter-gatherer peoples who had also survived the cataclysm. Indeed, even today, we have populations of hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, for instance, and in the Amazon jungle, who coexist with our advanced technological culture. So we shouldn't be surprised that equally disparate levels of civilization might have coexisted in the past. What I couldn't do when I wrote Fingerprints, because the data wasn't then available, was identify the exact nature of the cataclysm that had wiped out my hypothetical lost civilization. Instead, I speculated on a number of possible causes, notably the radical Earth crust displacement theory of Professor Charles Hapgood, which, though endorsed by Albert Einstein, has since found little favor amongst geologists. This absence of a credible smoking gun was one of the many aspects of my argument that was heavily criticized by archaeologists. Since 2007, however, a cascade of scientific evidence has come to light that has identified the smoking gun for me. It's all the more intriguing because it's the work of a large group of impressively credentialed mainstream scientists, and because it does not rule out, indeed, it in some ways reinforces, the case for massive crustal instability that I made in Fingerprints of the Gods. We'll explore this new evidence and its stunning implications in the following chapters. Part 2. Comet. Chapter 3. A wall of green water destroying everything in its path. Could certain ancient myths and traditions, judged to be of no historic value by scholars, in fact encode accurate recollections of an epoch when humanity experienced a crisis so devastating, so cataclysmic, and so dislocating that we lost our memory of our true past? Consider this account from the Ojibwa, a Native American people. The star with the long white tail is going to destroy the world someday when it comes low again. That's the comet called Long-Tailed Heavenly Climbing Star. It came down here once, thousands of years ago, just like the sun. It had radiation and burning heat in its tail. The comet burnt everything to the ground. There wasn't a thing left. Indian people were here before that happened, living on the earth. But things were wrong. A lot of people had abandoned the spiritual path. The Holy Spirit warned them a long time before the comet came. Medicine men told everyone to prepare. Things were wrong with nature on the earth. Then that comet went through here. It had a long white tail and it burnt up everything. It flew so low the tail scorched the earth. The comet made a different world. After that, survival was hard work. The weather was colder than before. There are other interesting details in the various versions of this myth told amongst the Ojibwa and recorded by anthropologist Thor Conway. For example, there's a reference to the comet killing off giant animals. You can find their bones today in the earth. It is said that the comet came down and spread his tail for miles and miles. At the time of this event, usually referred to as the first burning of the earth, we are told that the Ojibwa lived near the edge of the frozen lands. It's also recorded that soon after the comet disaster, the first flooding of the earth occurred. Just as the Ojibwa tradition laments that things were wrong, people had abandoned the spiritual path, thus implicating human behavior in the disaster that followed, so too the Brule, one of the tribes of the Lakota Nation, tell of a time in the world before this one when the people and animals turned to evil and forgot their connection to the Creator. In response, the Creator resolved to destroy the world and start over. He first warned a few good people to flee to the highest mountaintops, then sent down fierce thunderbirds to wage a great battle against the other humans and the giant animals. Again, as in the Ojibwa myth, the Brule account speaks of animals of extraordinary size. Finally, at the height of the battle, the thunderbirds suddenly threw down their most powerful thunderbolts all at once. The fiery blast shook the entire world, toppling mountain ranges and setting forests and prairies ablaze. The flames leapt up to the sky in all directions, sparing only the few people on the highest peaks. Even the rocks glowed red hot, and the giant animals and evil people burned up where they stood. Now the Creator began to make the world anew. As the Creator chanted the song of creation, it began to rain. The Creator sang louder, and it rained harder, until the rivers overflowed their banks and surged across the landscape. Finally, the Creator stamped the earth, and with a great quake, the earth split open, sending great torrents across the entire world, until only a few mountain peaks stood above the flood, sheltering the few people who had survived. After the flood subsided, as the people went out over the land, they found the bleached bones of the giant animals buried in rock and mud. People still find them today in the Dakota Badlands. Of particular note, when we remember that a species of giant beaver became extinct in North America at the end of the Ice Age, is a myth of the Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet. It speaks of a being called Glooskap, described as a spirit, a medicine man, and a sorcerer, who created the first animals, amongst them the first beaver, a creature so large that when it was a dam, it flooded the country from horizon to horizon. Glooskap tapped the beaver with its back and it shrank to its present size. The reference to a flood in this story is one amongst hundreds in the myths of the Native Americans. Many of them contain intriguing details of great relevance to new scientific information about North America at the end of the Ice Age that we will explore in the following pages. For example, the Cowichan of British Columbia recall a time in the remote past when their seers became greatly troubled on account of strange dreams which foretold destruction. One man said, "I have dreamed a strange thing. I dreamed that such rain fell that we were all drowned." Another said, "I dreamed that the river rose and flooded the place, and we were all destroyed." "So did I," chimed another, "and I too." The seers were disbelieved by their people, but nonetheless resolved to build a huge raft of many canoes joined together. Not long after they were done, the rain commenced. The drops were as large as hailstones, and so heavy that they killed the little babies. The river rose and all the valleys were covered. The seers, and those few of their friends who had believed them, took their families and placed them on the raft and took food and waited. By and by, the raft rose with the water. At length, the rain stopped, and they felt the waters going down, and their raft rested on the top of Cowichan Mountain. Then they saw the land, but what desolation met their eyes. How their hearts were wrung with anguish. It was indescribable. Unusually large hailstones feature in the Quileute cataclysm myth. For days and days, great storms blew. Rain and hail and then sleet and snow came down upon the land. The hailstones were so large that many of the people were killed. The survivors grew thin and weak from hunger. The hailstones had beaten down the ferns and the camas and the berries. Ice locked the rivers so that men could not fish. The Pima, or river people, presently live in Arizona, whence they migrated in remote antiquity from much further north. As is the case with the Cowichan, a seer features in their catechism traditions. In this case, a seer who was warned by a great eagle that the flood was coming. The eagle visited the seer 4 times, and each time he ignored its warnings. "You'd better believe what I'm telling you," said the eagle. "The whole valley will be flooded. Everything will be destroyed." "You're a liar," said the seer. "And you're a seer who sees nothing," said the eagle. The bird flew away, and hardly had it gone when a tremendous thunderclap was heard, the loudest there has ever been. The sun remained hidden behind dark clouds, and there was only twilight, grey and misty. Then the earth trembled, and there came a great roar of something immense moving. The people saw a sheer green wall advancing toward them, filling the valley from one side to the other. At first they did not know what it was, and then they realized that it was a wall of green water. Destroying everything in its path, it came like a huge beast, a green monster rushing upon them, foaming, hissing in a cloud of spray. It engulfed the seer's house and carried it away with the seer, who was never seen again. Then the water fell upon the villages, sweeping away homes, people, fields, and trees. The flood swept the valley clean as with a broom. Then it rushed on beyond the valley to wreak havoc elsewhere. The Inuit of Alaska preserve a tradition of an earthquake accompanied by a terrible flood that swept so rapidly over the earth that only a few people managed to escape in their canoes or take refuge on the top of the highest mountains. The Luiseno of California also remember a flood that covered the mountains and destroyed most of mankind. Only those few who fled to the highest peaks were spared when all the rest of the world was inundated. Similar flood myths were recorded amongst the Hurons, and the Montagnais, who belong to the Algonquin family, relate how the god Michabo reconstructed the world after a great flood. Michabo was hunting with his pack of trained wolves one day when he saw the strangest sight. The wolves entered a lake and disappeared. He followed them into the water to fetch them, and as he did so, the entire world flooded. Michabo then sent forth a raven to find some soil with which to make a new earth, but the bird returned unsuccessful in its quest. Then Michabo sent an otter to do the same thing, but again to no avail. Finally, he sent the muskrat, and she brought him back enough earth to begin the reconstruction of the world. Lynd's History of the Dakotas, written in the 19th century, preserves many indigenous traditions that would otherwise have been lost. These include an Iroquois myth that the sea and the waters had at one time infringed upon the land so that all human life was destroyed. The Chickasaws asserted that the world had been destroyed by water, but that one family was saved and 2 animals of every kind. The Lakota, Dakotas, also spoke of a time when there was no dry land and when all men disappeared from existence. Myths speaking to science. For years, an often acrimonious debate has been underway among scholars regarding the peopling of the Americas. Who are the Native Americans exactly? When did they first arrive in the New World, and by what route? Whenever a resolution has begun to look possible, whenever some kind of consensus has been about to emerge, new information has been presented by one side or the other that calls for a rethink. What has never been in dispute, however, is that the ancestors of today's Native Americans were already in North America 12,800 years ago, when the mysterious cold event that geologists called the Younger Dryas began, and that they witnessed and hunted the megafauna that flourished during the Ice Age, including the gigantic Columbia mammoth, the somewhat smaller woolly mammoth, the giant beaver, short-faced bears, giant sloths, 2 species of tapirs, several species of peccaries, and the fearsome American lion. It's thought likely, therefore, that the references to very large animals in the myths cited above are not mere fantasies, but preserve eyewitness accounts of some of the many genera of megamammals that were present in North America before the Younger Dryas began, but had passed into extinction by the time it ended 1,200 years later. The same goes for the floods that the myths describe, for geologists agree that North America was indeed subjected to episodes of cataclysmic flooding in the final millennia of the last Ice Age. What new research has called into question in the past decade, however, is whether the scale, extent, and most importantly, the causes of those floods have been properly understood. The mainstream view is copiously represented and endlessly repeated in books and journals published since the 1960s. But in order to get to grips with a powerful alternative view that now poses a serious challenge to established theories, I made an extensive field trip across North America in September and October 2014 with catastrophist researcher Randall Connelson. Randall cannot be a reincarnation of J. Harlan Bretz, because J. Harlan Bretz, whose first name was the letter J and who hated it when proofreaders tried to treat it like an initial, passed away on the 3rd of February 1981, by which time Randall was already 30 years old. However, in his passion for real fieldwork, for walking the walk, rather than just reading the literature, and in his dogged advocacy of a radical geological hypothesis concerning the cataclysmic floods that tore North America apart at the end of the Ice Age, Randall is, in every meaningful sense, the new J. Harlan Bretz. I will describe my travels with Randall and the compelling evidence he presented me with in the chapters that follow. But first, you may well be wondering, who was J. Harlan Bretz? Meet J. Harlan Bretz. Here is Bretz, writing in 1928 after one of his field trips across Washington state in the Pacific Northwest of the US. No one with an eye for landforms can cross eastern Washington in daylight without encountering and being impressed by the scabland. Like great scars marring the otherwise fair face of the plateau are these elongated tracts of bare or nearly bare black rock carved into mazes of buttes and canyons. Everybody on the plateau knows scabland. It interrupts the wheatlands, parceling them out into hill tracts less than 40 acres to more than 40 square miles in extent. One can neither reach them nor depart from them without crossing some part of the ramifying scabland. Aside from affording a scanty pasturage, scabland is almost without value. The popular name is an expressive metaphor. The scablands are wounds, only partially healed, great wounds in the epidermis of soil with which nature protects the underlying rock. With eyes only a few feet above the ground, the observer today must travel back and forth repeatedly and must record his observations mentally, photographically, by sketch and by map before he can form anything approaching a complete picture. Yet long before the paper bearing these words is yellowed, the average observer, looking down from the air as he crosses the region, will see almost at a glance the picture here drawn by piecing together the ground-level observations of months of work. The region is unique. Let the observer take the wings of the morning to the uttermost parts of the earth. He will nowhere find its likeness. By 1928, Bretz was an experienced and highly credentialed field geologist. Born in 1882, he'd started his career as a high school biology teacher in Seattle, but spent most of his spare time exploring the geology of Puget Sound. Although he didn't have a geology degree at the time, he succeeded in getting several articles on his findings published in scientific journals. In 1911, he enrolled at the University of Chicago to pursue a doctorate in geology. He graduated summa cum laude in 1913 and immediately thereafter returned to Seattle, where he accepted a position as assistant professor of geology at the University of Washington. He had difficulties with the attitudes of other teaching staff there. He later described them as stick in the muds. And by 1914, he was back at the University of Chicago, initially as an instructor, but soon afterward as an assistant professor. The first field trip Bretz made to the scablands of eastern Washington was in 1922. By this point, as a result of his earlier work, he was fully informed about the Ice Age in all its dimensions, and more aware than most other geologists that immense ice sheets up to 2 miles deep had covered North America for the best part of 100,000 years, until the ice melted dramatically somewhere between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago. Thus, when he saw huge numbers of erratics, giant boulders that didn't belong naturally in the area but had clearly been brought in from elsewhere, he was inclined to assume that they might have traveled here in icebergs, carried on some great glacial flood. This impression was strengthened when he explored Grand Coulee and Moses Coulee, gigantic channels gouged deeply in the earth, and visited the Quincy Basin at the southern end of Grand Coulee, where he found the whole 600 square mile depression filled up to a depth of 400 feet with small particles of basalt debris. He couldn't help but wonder, where had all the debris come from and when? Again, the answer that presented itself to him was a flood. Bretz was back in the scablands in 1923 for 3 months of exploration, and it seems to have been during this field trip that his later views, namely that some spectacular hydrological event had begun in this region, then abruptly stopped, really began to take shape. In the November to December 1923 issue of the Journal of Geology, Bretz published a paper summarizing his findings. To understand the somewhat defensive tone of the paper, it's important to keep in mind the prevailing geological doctrine of the time, the principle known as uniformitarianism. This is the assumption that existing processes, acting as at present, are sufficient to account for all geological changes. Integral to it is the parallel assumption of gradualism, namely that the present is the key to the past, and that the rate of change observable today is an accurate guide to rates of change that prevailed in the past. Such ideas, which had acquired the status of an unchallengeable truth by Bretz's day, had themselves arisen from the necessary, indeed essential, overthrow of the old religious belief in creationism and the notion that God whimsically intervened in the earth's history by ordaining cataclysms such as the biblical flood. In righteous opposition to these thoughts of supernatural creation and destruction, uniformitarianism seemed a profoundly rational response that saw only the forces of nature at work upon the earth over periods of millions, or indeed billions of years. Mountains had not been built overnight, but had risen slowly, imperceptibly, over time. Likewise had fantastic geological features such as the Grand Canyon been eroded by the flow of rivers over many millions of years. Bretz was an eminently rational man, and certainly no religious dogmatist. Yet, as his biographer John Sonnigsen notes, while hiking through the hot, dry, ragged world of the Scablands, everything he had seen pointed not to a slow, uniform change over time, but to a catastrophe, a sudden release of colossal quantities of water that had quickly washed away the loessial topsoil and then carved deeply into the basalt rock beneath. The problem was, where had all this water come from? It was well understood that at the margin of the North American ice sheets there must have been some melting, as one indeed sees at the edges of all glaciers today. But such melting could hardly explain the magnitude of the erosive changes that were visible in the field. As Bretz noted in his 1923 paper, the writer confesses that during 10 weeks of study of the region, each newly examined Scabland tract reawakened a feeling of amazement that such huge streams could take origin from such small, marginal tracts of an ice sheet, or that such an enormous amount of erosion, despite high gradients, could have resulted in the very brief times these streams existed. Not River Warren, nor the Chicago Outlet, not the Mohawk Channel, nor even Niagara Falls and Gorge itself approach the proportions of some of these Scabland tracts and their canyons. From one of these canyons alone, Upper Grand Coulee, 10 cubic miles of basalt was eroded by its glacial stream. Concluding the paper and moving towards the profoundly heretical and anti-uniformitarian idea that would soon get him into a great deal of trouble, namely that a single cataclysmic flood unleashed in a very short period had been responsible for all the devastation he had witnessed, Bretz wrote, "Fully 3,000 square miles of the Columbia Plateau were swept by the glacial flood, and the loess and silt cover removed. More than 2,000 square miles of this area were left as bare, eroded, rock-cut channel floors, now the Scablands, and nearly 1,000 square miles carry gravel deposits derived from the eroded basalt. It was a debacle which swept the Columbia Plateau." In other words, as Bretz's biographer summarizes, the geologist now believed that the features he had documented could only have been created by a flood of unimaginable proportions, possibly the largest flood in the history of the world. The reaction of the geological establishment was one of stunned, embarrassed silence. To have strayed so far from the doctrine of uniformitarianism could only mean that Bretz must have gone mad. David Alt, professor emeritus of geology at the University of Montana, describes one of the lectures that Bretz gave in which he expounded on the ideas in his 1923 paper. The geologists were aghast, in the same way that a room full of physicists would be upon hearing a colleague explain how he had made a perpetual motion machine out of old popsicle sticks. Physicists had all learned very early of the futility of perpetual motion machines, and no properly educated geologist was supposed to traffic in catastrophes of any sort. Alt describes an old professor of his own undergraduate days who had been a student sitting in the audience when Bretz read his 1923 paper. It seems the professor did a hilarious impersonation of Bretz, pounding on the podium with both fists and stomping on the floor, as he used vivid language and gestures to convey his idea of a catastrophic flood to his horrified audience. Quite apart from the theatricals, Alt says, the geologists were shocked to hear Bretz invoke a sudden catastrophe to explain the Scablands of eastern Washington. In their view, this was a reversion to the unscientific thinking of some 125 years before. To this day, most geologists consider it nothing less than heresy to invoke a catastrophic explanation for a geologic event. So Bretz stepped off the edge of a very long limb when he suggested that a great flood had eroded the Scablands. It made him a pariah amongst geologists, an outcast from the blighted precincts of society. The outcast did not give up, however. On the contrary, he doggedly continued with his research, bringing down ever more controversy on his head in the process, but believing that facts ultimately would vindicate him. The crunch came on the 12th of January 1927, when Bretz was ambushed by a lynch mob of his colleagues at a lecture he'd been invited to give to the Geological Society of Washington in the Cosmos Club, Washington, D.C. Bretz was now calling his flood the Spokane Flood, after the town of Spokane, and liked to refer to the ice sheet from which it had emerged as the Spokane Ice Sheet. Neither term is used today, but Bretz's Spokane Ice Sheet was, effectively, the southern part of that great late Pleistocene ice sheet now known as the Cordillera. He believed that large parts of it must have melted with extraordinary rapidity, because the volume of water was very great, almost incredibly great. In spite of high gradients to draw it off, the pre-existing valleys first entered were inadequate to carry it all, and the flood spread widely in a complicated group of anastomosing roots. W.C. Alden, then the chief of Pleistocene geology with the profoundly conservative U.S. Geological Survey, objected to the idea that all the channels must have been developed simultaneously in a very short time, and took great offense at the tremendous amount of water postulated by Bretz. It seems to me impossible, Alden protested, that such part of the great ice fields as would have drained across the Columbia Plateau could, under any conditions, have yielded so much water as is called for in so short a time. He admitted that he'd never visited the Scablands himself, but felt sure that a uniformitarian explanation was what was required. The problem would be easier if longer time and repeated floods could be allotted to do the work. James Gillooly, well known as an apostle of geologic gradualism, dismissed the notion of a single cataclysmic flood with words like preposterous, incompetent, and wholly inadequate. He found nothing in Bretz's evidence to exclude his own preferred solution, namely that multiple smaller floods had been involved, and that these would have been of the order of magnitude of the present Columbias, or at most a few times as large. Likewise, G.R. Mansfield doubted that so much work could be done on basalt in so short a time. The Scablands seemed to me better explained as the effects of persistent ponding and overflow of marginal glacial waters, which changed their position or their places of outlet from time to time through a somewhat protracted period. O.E. Meinzer was obliged to confess that the erosion features of the region are large and bizarre, but he too preferred a gradualist explanation. Before a theory that requires a seemingly impossible quantity of water is fully accepted, every effort should be made to account for the existing features without employing so violent an assumption. I believe the existing features can be explained by assuming normal streamwork of the ancient Columbia River. In summary, not a single voice was raised in support of Bretz, and there was much patronizing dismissal of his outrageous hypothesis of a single large flood. In particular, the massed geologists homed in on what they clearly believed was the fatal flaw in the case for a sudden and overwhelming cataclysm, namely that Bretz had failed to identify a convincing source for his floodwaters. Bretz replied that he saw no logic in this, since lack of a documented source for the flood did not prove that there had been no flood. I believe my interpretation of channeled Scabland should stand or fail on the Scabland phenomena themselves, he argued. He was, he said, as sensitive as anyone else to adverse criticism, and had no desire to invite attention simply by advocating extremely novel views. Moreover, he himself had repeatedly been driven to doubt the verity of the Spokane flood, only to be forced by reconsideration of the field evidence to use again the conception of enormous volume. These remarkable records of running water on the Columbia Plateau and in the valleys of the Snake and Columbia rivers cannot be interpreted in terms of ordinary river action and ordinary valley development. Enormous volume, existing for a very short time, alone will account for their existence.
It was this accumulation of compelling field evidence that Bretz asked to be considered not by emotion, not by intuition, not by reference to received wisdom, but only by the established principles of the scientific method. Ideas without precedent, he was to write later, are generally looked on with disfavor, and men are shocked if their conceptions of an orderly world are challenged. A hypothesis, earnestly defended, begets emotional reaction, which may cloud the protagonist's view. But if such hypotheses outrage prevailing modes of thought, the view of antagonists may also become fogged. On the other hand, geology is plagued with extravagant ideas which spring from faulty observation and misinterpretation. They are worse than outrageous hypotheses, for they lead nowhere. The writer's Spokane flood hypothesis may belong to the latter class, but it cannot be placed there unless errors of observation and direct inference are demonstrated. And this was the problem with all the criticisms of Bretz, both before and after the Washington meeting. The geological establishment didn't like what he had to say. It flew in the face of their gradualist reference frame, and they regarded it as a heresy that must be gently but firmly stamped out. In the final analysis, however, they couldn't disprove his science, only disapprove of it, which is a very different thing. The heart of the matter remained Bretz's assertion that the ice cap had melted precipitously, and his inability to propose a mechanism that could have brought about such melting. He himself, as noted, did not regard this as a significant stumbling block, but his critics did. Over the years, therefore, in attempts to appease them, he several times reluctantly proposed two possible solutions. These were some sort of radical, short-lived climate change on the one hand, or on the other, an episode of volcanic activity beneath the ice cap. He admitted of the former, however, that no such climatic change is recorded elsewhere, and the rapidity demanded seems impossible. While of the latter, he observed that nothing has been found in the literature to suggest Pleistocene volcanism in the area which was drained across the Columbia Plateau. Interestingly, by the time Bretz faced his hostile peers in Washington, he was already aware of, but had dismissed, the very explanation for cataclysmic flooding that would much later be taken up by the geological establishment and open the door to the universal acceptance of his evidence that prevails today. In his outline for his January 1927 presentation, he wrote, "Both Mr. Alden and Mr. Pardee have suggested that I consider the sudden draining of a glacial lake to account for the flood." Mr. Pardee, in a 1925 letter to Bretz, specifies Lake Missoula, which is the only one of any magnitude known in the region that might have functioned. Eventually, in the 1940s, Bretz would indeed embrace a sudden draining of glacial Lake Missoula as the source of his flood. But the reason why he did not do so in 1927 is important, and as we shall see, of the greatest relevance to the evolving debate about what exactly happened in North America at the end of the Ice Age. In brief, Bretz's view in 1927, as his biographer explains, was that the volume of Lake Missoula might not have been adequate to form the Scablands. It would run the flood for only 2 weeks, reads a handwritten comment by Bretz in this section of his outline. In March 1930, Bretz published a brief abstract in the Bulletin of the Geological Society of America. The abstract was titled Lake Missoula and the Spokane Flood. In it, Bretz wrote that this lake had first been named and described by the geologist J.T. Pardee, whose letter on the subject he'd received in 1925, that it stood more than 4,000 feet above sea level, and that it was at least 2,100 feet deep. Without going into any detail, he noted that the lake had been held in place by an ice dam, and that 70 miles to the southwest, along the western arm of the Purcell Trench and the Spokane Valley, are the easternmost heads of the Scabland channels. If a bursting of the dam occurred, water could only escape along this 70-mile stretch. By 1932, Bretz had warmed further to the idea that Lake Missoula could be the culprit behind his flood, although he felt that issues concerning the hypothetical ice dam and its proposed cataclysmic failure remained to be worked out. At this point in his life, however, he seemed ready to move on and was to devote most of the next decade to other completely different geological puzzles. Then in 1940,
He was invited to speak on his scablands theory at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science being held in Seattle. He declined the invitation, saying that his views and evidence were already in print. But the event turned out to be a seminal one. J.T. Pardee was there and presented a paper on his work on glacial Lake Missoula, making public for the first time his long-held conclusion that there had been a failure of an ice dam and that the entire lake had drained catastrophically and most likely quite dramatically. Curiously, Pardee did not connect his Missoula findings to Brett's own long-standing and well-known case about the creation of the channeled scablands by a catastrophic flood. But much later, Bretz would write, "He never said, at least in print, anything about the final deposition of this vigorous discharge. I do believe, however, that he was generously leaving that to me." In the process of making the most of what had been left to him, Bretz abandoned his single cataclysmic flood model in favor of one more palatable to his opponents. There were several floods he was eventually to write in 1959. The theory is elastic enough to take care of that. In the same year, Bretz was presented with the Neil Milner Award in honor of his exceptional contributions to earth sciences. A few years later, in 1965, Bretz's transformation from pariah to poster boy seemed complete. The International Union for Quaternary Research organized a field trip to the Columbia Plateau for many former critics of the catastrophic flood theory. The group traversed the full length of Grand Coulee, part of the Quincy Basin, and much of the Palouse Snake Scabland Divide. At the end of the trip, the participants, humbled by what they had seen and satisfied as to the source of the flood damage in glacial Lake Missoula, sent Bretz a telegram of greetings and salutations. The telegram closed with the words, "We are all now catastrophists." "Be assured," wrote Bretz, "that after 30 years and 30 papers in self-defense and more than 30 people who vigorously denied my theory, it did my heart good like medicine." The final accolade came in 1979, when Bretz, by then aged 96, received the Penrose Medal, the Geological Society of America's highest accolade. After this award, he told his son, "All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over." Bretz went on to his next great adventure, aged 98 years, on the 3rd of February 1981. Gradualism draws the teeth of Bretz's cataclysm. So, all seemed well. The evidence of a land scoured by cataclysmic deluge could not be denied. The timing had been set, perhaps not precisely, but at any rate somewhere in the last millennia of the Ice Age, between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago. The source of the deluge had been tracked down to glacial Lake Missoula, and the crunch point of whether there had been just one gigantic flood, which Bretz's honed instincts as a field geologist had originally suggested, or multiple floods, as his gradualist colleagues preferred, had been conceded with reference to the elasticity of his theory and an allowance of several floods. It becomes clear in later papers published by Bretz that he was willing to accept that up to 8 floods had occurred. This was undoubtedly a concession to gradualism. 8 smaller floods, politely spread out over a period of some thousands of years, being more palatable to those of a uniformitarian persuasion, i.e. to most geologists then and now, than a single humongous event of great violence that occurred suddenly, did massive damage, and was over and done with in about 3 months. Nonetheless, Bretz remained a catastrophist at heart. Victor R. Baker of the Department of Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of Arizona notes in his study The Spokane Flood Debates that while Bretz did indeed extensively modify his original hypothesis, there was a lingering suspicion that one was dealing with an unusual exception to a general rule. Bretz himself had claimed the unique assemblage of forms described as the channeled scabland records a unique episode in Pleistocene history. Special causes seem clearly indicated. In other words, regardless of any concessions, what is referred to here are causes that were still unique and special enough to be described as catastrophic, and that did not undermine the conclusion that it was a debacle which swept the Columbia Plateau. It is surely significant that in his last published work, a note he wrote to the Geological Society of America in 1979, accepting its highest accolade, the Penrose Medal, that Bretz took the opportunity to drive this point home. Perhaps, he wrote, I can be credited with reviving and demystifying legendary catastrophism and challenging a too rigorous uniformitarianism. What Bretz, the catastrophist and challenger of uniformitarianism, could not have known, however, was that once he had invited the vampire of gradualism through the door, it would not be satisfied with the compromise that he had tried to strike, but would keep on remorselessly sucking the blood out of any notion that what had happened in the Channel Scablands had been any sort of debacle at all. Thus, as the years have gone by, and new generations of gradualist scholars have taken their places at universities around the world, the 8 floods that were first allowed to modify Bretz's single cataclysm have steadily increased in number, to a dozen, then to more than 20, then to 35, then to about 40, and finally, in recent papers, to as many as 90 or more. The most current opinion, summarizes Vic Baker, is that there were about 80 floods that all occurred within a period of 2,500 years, roughly between 15,000 years ago and 12,000 years ago, possibly at regular intervals. 80 floods in 2,500 years works out at 1 flood approximately every 31 years, thus doing away with any need for a single exceptional cataclysm and accounting for the horrendous mess of the Channel Scablands by the accumulated effects of a rather regular, predictable, essentially gradualist series of events. Better still, from a uniformitarian point of view, outburst floods from ice-dammed glacial lakes still occur today. They happen regularly in Iceland, for example, where they're called jokulaups, a term that has been adopted for them worldwide and that I will continue to use here. Other locations where they are common include the Himalayas, Antarctica, northern Sweden, and North America. As geology professor David Alt points out, several glacially dammed lakes in Alaska and northern British Columbia are prone to episodes of very fast drainage. These events usually occur in summer when a fast snowmelt rapidly raises the level of the lake. The ice dam that held glacial Lake Missoula probably floated and broke during the summer for the same reason. In this way, the uniformitarian doctrine that the present is the key to the past, and that the rate of change observable today is an accurate guide to rates of change that prevailed in the past, has quietly reasserted itself. And Bretz's disturbing flood evidence has been explained away as nothing very much to worry about after all. The scholars have also rather cleverly contrived to have their cake and eat it, on the one hand giving Bretz a medal, and proclaiming that they are all catastrophists now. On the other, quietly transmuting Bretz's catastrophe into the sort of thing that one sees every summer in Alaska and British Columbia. This is all very reassuring, of course, but suppose that Bretz's original insight was right, and that what happened in North America at the end of the Ice Age really was a sudden cataclysmic flood, something unprecedented and unmatched since. Suppose it really was a debacle. Back to Bretz. Randall Carlson is quite certain that it was indeed a debacle, one that unfolded on an almost unbelievable scale, and has spent the last 20 years trekking back and forth across the Channel Scablands, asking local geologists difficult questions that no one else seems to have considered, and building a formidable case. The sort of case, I suspect, that Bretz would be making if he were still with us and at the height of his powers. I first met Randall in 2006. The North American Ice Age floods were amongst the subjects we discussed, and I was startled to discover that he didn't accept the ice dam theory at all, and regarded glacial Lake Missoula as a huge diversion, an easy solution that panders to uniformitarian prejudices and has led geologists away from the truth. In the years that followed, we corresponded from time to time and occasionally bumped into each other at conferences where we were both speaking. I was enormously impressed by his depth of knowledge, by his field experience, and by the intriguing new insights his research seemed to offer into the mysterious events that brought the Ice Age to an end. I found we shared a particular and growing interest in the Younger Dryas, that return to full glacial conditions that began suddenly 12,800 years ago, just when the world seemed to be warming up, and that ended equally suddenly 1,200 years later. During this peculiar episode, certain Stone Age hunter-gatherer peoples such as the Clovis culture of North America vanished from the archaeological record, and there were mass extinctions of animal species, so clearly something unusual was going on. Yet no uniformitarian or gradualist explanations have ever been offered. Moreover, although I didn't investigate it in my 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, I realized afterwards that the span of the Younger Dryas from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago coincided exactly with the window during which I had argued that an advanced civilization of prehistoric antiquity was obliterated from the face of the earth and lost from human memory. Accordingly, in my book Underworld, published in 2002, I was more attentive to the Younger Dryas problem. At around 13,000 years ago, I noted, the long period of uninterrupted warming that the world had just passed through, and that had greatly intensified according to some studies between 15,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago, was instantly brought to a halt, all at once, everywhere, by a global cold event known to paleoclimatologists as the Younger Dryas. In many ways mysterious and unexplained, this was an almost unbelievably fast climatic reversion, from conditions that are calculated to have been warmer and wetter than today's 13,000 years ago, to conditions that were colder and drier than those at the last glacial maximum just a few hundred years later. From that moment, around 12,800 years ago, it was as though an enchantment of ice had gripped the Earth. In many areas that had been approaching terminal meltdown, full glacial conditions were restored with breathtaking rapidity, and all the gains that had been made since the LGM, last glacial maximum around 21,000 years ago, were simply stripped away. Temperatures fell back on the order of 8 to 15 degrees centigrade, with half the brutal decline possibly occurring within decades. The polar front in the North Atlantic redescended to the level of Cabo Finisterre in northwest Spain, and glaciers re-advanced in the high mountain chains. With respect to temperature, the setback to full glacial conditions was nearly complete. For human populations at the time, in many except the most accidentally favored parts of the world, the sudden and inexplicable plunge into severe cold and aridity must have been devastating. The sense of mystery and mortal danger to mankind that clung about the Younger Dryas continued to intrigue me, encouraging me to read up on it and try to understand it better. I recall a number of conversations and email exchanges with Randall after 2006 that focused on the subject, and it became increasingly obvious to me that the Younger Dryas had been a global cataclysm in every meaningful sense of the term. It wasn't until 2013, however, when Randall made the case to me that North America, and particularly the Channel Scablands, had stood at the epicenter of that cataclysm, that I decided it was time to see the evidence on the ground. On impulse, I invited him to join me on a field trip. It took more than a year to find a time that worked for both our schedules, but finally, in September 2014, I met Randall in Portland, Oregon, and we took off east and north into neighboring Washington state to explore the Scablands in the big red four-wheel drive we'd hired. Chapter 4, Journey Through the Scablands. We're on a 2,500-mile, 4,000-kilometer road trip from Portland, Oregon to Minneapolis, Minnesota. The journey would be shorter if we took the direct route, but we're stopping and diverting into coulees and river valleys and around buttes and up the sides of mountains and across the channeled Scablands immediately south of the vast Cordilleran and Laurentide ice caps that once covered much of North America. The objective is for me to get as full an understanding as possible of what happened here, and by the fourth day, when we reach Dry Falls, in the middle of the extraordinary scar on the landscape called Grand Coulee, the picture is beginning to become clear. The ground under our feet is ancient black basalt, covered with a thin layer of topsoil. The basalt, extruded by volcanic eruptions between 17 million and 6 million years ago, covers much of the Columbian Plateau, and in some places is 2,000 meters, 6,600 feet thick. Not in Grand Coulee, though, because here it's as if some capricious force, perhaps even the hand of God himself, has seized a giant chisel with a blade miles wide, plunged it violently into the earth, and gouged out a sheer-sided gash hundreds of feet deep and almost 60 miles, 96 kilometers long. The chisel, however, was not made of steel, but of immense quantities of rushing, turbulent, debris-laden water that flowed for a few weeks only. The water of Bretz's flood. Grand Coulee, he wrote, affords the greatest example of canyon cutting by glacial streams, not alone for the Columbian Plateau, but for the world. A glacial river 3 miles in minimum width spilled southward here over the divide and down a steep monoclinal slope. The stream descended nearly 1,000 feet on a grade of approximately 10 degrees. Such a situation is unparalleled even in this region of huge, suddenly initiated high-gradient rivers. At least 10 cubic miles of basalt were excavated and removed. Bretz refers here only to the northern or upper part of Grand Coulee, but the same amount of basalt again was also excavated from lower Grand Coulee as the stream rushed on. Making our way